They looked ordinary. They lived ordinary lives. And that is what made it terrifying. In a quiet England that believed danger wore a visible face, two people moved unnoticed, blending into routine, trust, and everyday life. No alarms rang. No one suspected. Yet beneath the calm streets and silent moors, a story was unfolding that would forever change how the world understood evil, control, and human darkness. This is not just the story of crimes that shocked a nation. It is the story of how silence, trust, and unseen manipulation allowed unimaginable horror to grow unnoticed. A story of lives lost, voices unheard, and a truth that still echoes across generations. Tonight, we don't seek fear, we seek understanding. Because sometimes the most frightening truths are not found in chaos, but in quiet places where no one thinks to look. Thank you for walking with me through this difficult and important chapter of history. Stories like these are not easy to hear, but understanding them helps us protect the future and honor the voices that were lost. When we remember, we learn. And when we learn, we become more aware of the world and of one another. If this series gave you a deeper perspective, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow and allows more stories like this to be told with care, respect, and truth. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. A Quiet England Before the Storm. The England of the early 1960s often appears, in memory, as a place suspended between worlds. The scars of war were still visible in brickwork and silence, yet hope moved gently through ordinary streets. Families rebuilt their lives in modest homes. Children played under gray skies, and the rhythm of daily routine offered comfort in its predictability. It was an era that believed stability had returned, that the darkest chapters of human cruelty were behind them. Yet beneath this calm surface, something deeply unsettling was forming, unnoticed, unheard, and almost impossible to imagine. In the industrial towns of northern England, life moved at a steady, almost hypnotic pace. Factory whistles marked the hours. Neighbors knew one another by name. Doors were left unlocked, not out of carelessness, but trust. It was a time when danger was thought to be distant, something that happened elsewhere, not in quiet communities shaped by routine and restraint. This illusion of safety would soon be shattered in ways that reshaped the nation's understanding of evil. The moors themselves stretched endlessly across the Pennines, vast and empty, shaped by wind and silence. To many, they were places of quiet beauty, where the sky felt larger and thoughts could wander freely. But the same isolation that made the moors peaceful also made them unknowable. Fog rolled in without warning. Footsteps disappeared without trace. The land did not speak, and it did not remember. It simply endured. Long before anyone suspected what would one day be hidden beneath its soil, the moors waited patiently, indifferent to human suffering. In nearby towns like Manchester and its surrounding districts, post-war life carried on with careful optimism. New housing estates rose where bomb damage once scarred the land. Radios played softly in kitchens. People trusted faces they recognized and rarely questioned those who appeared polite, reserved, or well-spoken. Evil, when imagined, wore obvious masks. It did not smile politely or speak with quiet intelligence. That belief would prove tragically wrong. This was also a time when emotional repression shaped daily life. Conversations about fear, trauma, or inner darkness were often avoided. Mental health was poorly understood, and emotional suffering was something to be endured quietly rather than explored. In this silence, certain individuals learned how to hide in plain sight, how to appear unremarkable while nurturing thoughts that had no place in the daylight world. The absence of open dialogue created spaces where darkness could grow without challenge. Children walked to school alone. Teenagers gathered freely, trusting the world would protect them. Parents believed that danger came from strangers who looked frightening, not from ordinary faces offering kindness. This trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. Yet before that rupture, innocence shaped the rhythms of everyday life, and no one imagined that history was quietly rearranging itself behind closed doors. The Britain of this era was also undergoing social transition. Traditional authority structures were beginning to loosen, but moral certainty still dominated public thinking. People believed in clear lines between right and wrong, good and evil. Few understood that such lines could blur, or that evil could exist without spectacle. This misunderstanding would later make the truth even harder to accept. In these years, two individuals moved through their separate lives unnoticed, shaped by experiences that would eventually converge. Their paths had not yet crossed, and nothing about them openly signaled the horror that lay ahead. They lived among ordinary people, worked ordinary jobs, and blended seamlessly into the background of everyday society. Their inner worlds, however, were forming in silence, influenced by isolation, curiosity, control, and an unsettling fascination with power. The calm before the storm is often quiet not because nothing is happening, but because the warning signs are misunderstood. In hindsight, fragments of behavior might seem meaningful, yet at the time they appeared harmless, even forgettable. That is what made the coming events so profoundly disturbing. The realization that evil did not arrive loudly, but softly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the 1960s progressed, British society continued forward, unaware that it stood on the edge of a reckoning. Newspapers filled with ordinary headlines. Families planned holidays. Life moved on, steady and predictable. Meanwhile, the Moors remained silent witnesses, stretching endlessly beneath shifting skies, holding secrets not yet written but already forming. This chapter is not about violence, nor about the acts that would later define history. It is about the world before those acts occurred, a world that believed itself safe, a world that trusted too easily, a world that never imagined how profoundly it would soon be changed. In the quiet moments before sleep, when thoughts slow and the mind drifts, it is often hard to imagine how darkness enters the human story. It rarely arrives with noise or warning. More often, it slips in gently, disguised as normality, patience, and time. And in that stillness, long before the nation would learn the names Brady and Myra Hindley, the foundations of tragedy were already being laid, unnoticed beneath the calm surface of everyday life. As the early 1960s unfolded, Britain moved gently between tradition and change, unaware that some of its deepest assumptions about safety, innocence, and human nature were about to be tested. There was a quiet confidence in the air, the kind that settles into a society when survival feels assured. The war had ended more than a decade earlier, and although its shadows lingered in memories and architecture, people were eager to believe the worst was behind them. Progress, stability, and order seemed permanent. In towns across northern England, daily life followed familiar rhythms. Workers rose early, children gathered in schoolyards, and evenings were often spent listening to the radio or sharing modest meals. Conversations rarely wandered into uncomfortable emotional territory. Pain, confusion, or fear were things to be endured silently, not examined. This cultural restraint shaped how people saw one another, not as complex inner worlds, but as predictable roles. A neighbor was simply a neighbor. A colleague was just that. Few felt the need to look deeper. This emotional distance created an environment where surface appearances carried extraordinary weight. Politeness became proof of trustworthiness. Intelligence suggested reliability. Calmness implied stability. Those who mastered these traits could pass unnoticed, even admired. And in that quiet admiration, danger could take root without drawing attention. The Moors remained ever present, stretching across the landscape like a living memory of the ancient past. They were beautiful, solemn, and vast. Locals knew them as places for walking, reflection, and solitude. Visitors saw them as wild and romantic. But their isolation also meant that they swallowed sound, erased footprints, and concealed anything placed within them. Long before they would become associated with darkness, they were simply part of the land, indifferent to human emotion. What made this period especially fragile was the deep belief in moral certainty. People trusted that wrongdoers could be easily identified, that evil had a recognizable shape. Society relied on intuition rather than awareness. This belief would later fracture when it became clear that appearances could deceive and that danger could wear an ordinary face. Psychology, as a field, had not yet entered mainstream understanding. Emotional trauma, obsession, and compulsive thinking were rarely discussed openly. Troubled minds often suffered in silence, unexamined and untreated. This silence did not erase the thoughts within. It merely gave them room to grow unchecked. In such an environment, some individuals learned to hide behind intelligence, charm, or quiet reserve, while their inner worlds grew increasingly detached from moral boundaries. Meanwhile, youth culture was slowly evolving. Music, fashion, and new ideas challenged traditional norms. Yet beneath this surface change, authority and hierarchy remained strong. Adults were trusted implicitly. Questioning them was discouraged. Children were taught obedience, not skepticism. This imbalance of power would later reveal itself as a dangerous vulnerability at the same time. Communities still believed that familiarity meant safety. A familiar face implied good intentions. The idea that harm could come from someone known, someone who blended in, felt unthinkable. This belief was not naive. It was inherited, passed down through generations that had relied on community cohesion for survival. But the world was changing, and old assumptions no longer offered protection in this atmosphere. Two individuals moved quietly toward a convergence neither the world nor they themselves fully understood. Their early lives had been shaped by different forms of isolation, emotional absence, and internal conflict. Yet none of this appeared unusual from the outside. They did not announce themselves as dangerous. They did not draw attention. They observed, absorbed, and waited. What makes this period so haunting is not what happened, but what didn't. No alarms were raised. No warnings sounded. Teachers, neighbors, co-workers. None sensed the slow alignment of forces taking place beneath the surface of ordinary life. History often teaches us that catastrophe announces itself loudly, but the truth is more unsettling. It often begins in silence. The air of post-war Britain carried both hope and suppression. People wanted peace, normalcy, and predictability. In seeking these comforts, many overlooked subtle warning signs. It wasn't negligence, but trust in social order, in appearances, in the belief that certain horrors belonged only to distant places or times. As the years edged forward, small choices accumulated quietly. Conversations took place that seemed insignificant. Thoughts were formed that remained unspoken. Bonds developed that felt harmless on the surface. Yet every moment nudged reality closer to a point of no return. The Moors, vast and patient, bore silent witness to it all. They did not judge or interfere. They simply waited, as they always had, indifferent to human intention. Long before tragedy would stain their soil, they stood beneath open skies, holding secrets that no one yet knew existed, in the stillness of night. When the world slept and minds wandered freely, the boundary between imagination and intent began to blur for those who would one day reshape history in the most devastating way. This was not the beginning of violence, but the beginning of alignment, of paths slowly bending toward one another. And so, England moved forward, unaware that the quiet it cherished was already fractured. The storm had not yet arrived, but its shadow had begun to stretch across the land. What came next would not only alter lives, but permanently alter how a nation understood trust, evil, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the most terrifying stories begin without a sound. Chapter 2. Ian Brady, a mind shaped by isolation. Ian Brady was not born into darkness, yet darkness would come to shape him long before the world knew his name. His story begins quietly, in circumstances that offered little warmth and even less stability. Born in Glasgow in 1938, during a time when the world itself seemed uncertain, his earliest experiences were marked by displacement, emotional absence, and a growing sense of detachment. From the beginning, his life unfolded not with chaos, but with a quiet emotional distance that would deepen over time. Brady was born to an unmarried mother at a time when such circumstances carried heavy social stigma. Almost immediately, he was placed into foster care, separated from any sense of maternal bond before it could form. This early disruption, though not uncommon in post-war Britain, shaped the foundation of his emotional world. Attachment, trust, and belonging, things most children absorb instinctively, became fragile concepts for him. Psychologists would later suggest that such early separations can leave lasting imprints, especially when paired with emotional neglect. He was eventually taken in by a working-class family in Glasgow who provided food, shelter, and structure. On the surface, his upbringing appeared stable. There was no obvious cruelty, no outward chaos. Yet affection was limited, discipline was strict, and emotional expression was rare. Love, if present, was practical rather than nurturing. In this environment, young Ian learned to observe rather than participate, to retreat inward rather than seek comfort outwardly. Even as a child, he stood apart. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his detachment. He was quiet, introspective, and often appeared emotionally distant from his peers. While other children played, he watched. While others laughed, he analyzed. This sense of being separate from the world around him became a defining feature of his identity. It wasn't that he lacked awareness. It was that he viewed human interaction as something external, something to be studied rather than felt. Books became his refuge. Through reading, he accessed ideas and philosophies far removed from the gray streets of his upbringing. He gravitated toward themes of power, control, and existential thought. Unlike escapist fiction, he was drawn to darker material that explored dominance, morality, and the limits of human behavior. These ideas did not disturb him, they fascinated him. Over time, intellectual curiosity began to intertwine with emotional detachment, creating a private inner world where empathy struggled to take root as adolescence approached. His sense of alienation deepened. He did not feel connected to those around him, nor did he seem troubled by that fact. While others formed friendships and explored identity through shared experience, Brady withdrew further into himself. He was often described as polite, articulate, and reserved, qualities that masked the growing disconnect beneath the surface. His silence was interpreted as maturity, not isolation. There were early signs of moral disconnection. Petty crimes and acts of defiance emerged during his teenage years, not driven by desperation, but by curiosity and control. Authority fascinated him, not in the sense of respecting it, but in understanding how it functioned and how it could be challenged. When consequences followed, he accepted them with a chilling calm, as though they were experiments rather than punishments. During this period, he spent time in a youth detention center, an experience that further shaped his worldview. Rather than reforming him, it reinforced his sense of separation from society. He observed others closely, learning how power operated in closed systems. He learned how fear worked, how influence could be exerted subtly, and how intelligence could mask intention. The environment did not frighten him, it educated him. Upon release, he entered adult life outwardly composed and capable. He held jobs, interacted politely, and maintained an appearance of normalcy. Yet internally, his emotional landscape was increasingly barren. Compassion did not come naturally. Moral boundaries felt abstract. He viewed human connection less as a shared experience and more as a structure that could be examined, manipulated, or dismissed. This emotional detachment did not announce itself loudly. Those who encountered him saw a quiet, thoughtful young man. Some even found him intriguing. He was well-spoken, reserved, and seemingly self-possessed. These traits created a kind of social camouflage, allowing him to blend into ordinary environments without suspicion. What made his psychological evolution particularly dangerous was the absence of outward chaos. There were no dramatic outbursts, no obvious cruelty. His darkness was internal, intellectualized, and controlled. He did not act impulsively. He contemplated. He did not seek attention. He sought understanding, not of others, but of his own sense of power over them. As the years progressed, his internal world became increasingly disconnected from shared moral frameworks. He developed a belief that ordinary social rules did not apply to him. This sense of superiority, combined with emotional detachment, formed a foundation that would later allow him to rationalize the unthinkable. Yet at this stage, no one saw a monster. There were no alarms, no clear signs of what lay ahead. He moved through society as an observer, quietly absorbing knowledge, refining his worldview, and waiting, though even he may not have known what he was waiting for. This was the man before the infamy, not yet a symbol of terror, but a study in isolation, control, and emotional distance. A person shaped less by chaos than by silence. And in that silence, something dangerous was steadily taking form. As Ian Brady moved deeper into adulthood, the distance between his internal world and the society around him continued to widen. What made this separation so dangerous was how quietly it developed. There were no dramatic collapses, no outward signs of instability. Instead, there was a slow crystallization of belief, an internal philosophy shaped by intellect, ego, and a growing sense of emotional detachment from humanity itself. Brady's interest in philosophy and ideology became more pronounced during this period. He read widely, often gravitating toward material that explored dominance, power structures, and the nature of evil. These were not casual curiosities. He studied them with intensity, absorbing ideas not as abstract concepts, but as frameworks through which he interpreted the world. Rather than seeking moral understanding, he sought justification. Ideas became tools, ways to rationalize emotional emptiness and elevate himself above those he saw as ordinary. What distinguished him from many troubled individuals was his ability to intellectualize cruelty. He did not act out of impulsive rage or emotional chaos. Instead, he viewed human behavior as something to be examined, controlled, and, if necessary, overridden. Compassion was not something he struggled to express. It was something he consciously dismissed. In his internal logic, empathy was weakness and detachment was strength. This mindset shaped how he interacted with others. He was capable of charm when it served him, capable of silence when it didn't. He listened more than he spoke, observed more than he participated. People often mistook this for thoughtfulness or depth. In reality, it was calculation. He learned how others reacted emotionally, how trust was formed, and how easily perceptions could be guided. These observations became tools, refined quietly over time. As he entered the workforce, he blended in seamlessly. He held jobs, followed routines, and maintained a composed exterior. Colleagues saw him as reserved but intelligent, someone who kept to himself. There was nothing overtly alarming about his presence. Yet beneath that surface, his internal world continued to grow colder, more detached, and increasingly self-justifying. One of the most unsettling aspects of Brady's development was his growing sense of superiority. He believed himself intellectually above those around him, capable of understanding truths others could not. This belief fed a quiet arrogance, one that allowed him to view people not as individuals with inner lives, but as elements within his personal philosophy. Their emotions, fears, and vulnerabilities became abstract concepts rather than realities deserving of care. Isolation played a crucial role in reinforcing this mindset. While others built emotional connections, Brady remained largely alone by choice. Solitude gave him uninterrupted space to think, to refine his worldview without challenge. In that silence, empathy continued to erode. The absence of emotional bonds meant there was no internal resistance to dark ideas taking root. Yet despite this inner detachment, he did not present as hostile or unstable. On the contrary, he often appeared calm, composed, even thoughtful. This duality made him difficult to read and nearly impossible to predict. Those who encountered him saw only what he allowed them to see. His inner life remained hidden, protected by intelligence and restraint. As time passed, his thoughts grew more extreme, but still remained internal. He did not seek immediate expression. Instead, he waited, observed, refined. His patience was perhaps his most dangerous quality. Where others might act impulsively, he calculated. Where others might hesitate, he rationalized. This slow progression allowed his mindset to deepen without interruption. Psychologically, he was drifting further from shared human experience. The emotional responses that guide moral decision-making, guilt, empathy, remorse, held little meaning for him. He did not feel bound by them. Instead, he constructed his own internal logic, one in which power, control, and intellectual dominance were central. This self-created framework insulated him from doubt and reinforced his sense of superiority. It is important to understand that at this stage, no crimes had yet defined him. There were no headlines, no public awareness, no sense of impending horror. He existed in the margins of society, unremarkable and unremarked upon. That is what made his development so dangerous. There was nothing to stop it. No intervention, no alarm. The environment around him offered neither challenge nor containment. Society assumed normality where there was none. And so he continued forward, shaped by isolation, intellect, and an ever-deepening emotional void. In time, this internal world would collide with another, one shaped by vulnerability, longing, and the desire for belonging. That collision would alter both lives forever. But at this moment, Ian Brady remained alone, quietly becoming someone capable of unimaginable acts, without yet revealing a single sign to the world watching unknowingly around him. This was not the story of sudden transformation, but of gradual descent, a mind forming in silence, a philosophy growing unchecked, a human being drifting further from the shared moral ground that binds society together. And as this transformation continued, fate moved closer to introducing him to the one person who would amplify everything he had become. Chapter 3. Myra Hindley. The girl behind the smile. Before her name became synonymous with horror, before it echoed through courtrooms and newspaper headlines, Myra Hindley was simply a girl growing up in post-war England, shaped not by cruelty, but by contradiction. Her early life did not point toward darkness in any obvious way. Instead, it unfolded quietly, wrapped in routine, discipline, and a longing to belong. To understand her path, one must first understand the world that shaped her, a world of rigid expectations, emotional restraint, and unspoken tension beneath domestic normality. Born in Manchester in 1942, Myra grew up during a period of rebuilding. Britain was still healing from the war, and families were learning how to survive emotionally as well as materially. Her childhood home was structured, orderly, and disciplined. Her father, a stern and authoritative figure, believed in control, obedience, and emotional restraint. Affection was not freely given, and vulnerability was often viewed as weakness. Her mother, quieter and more submissive, attempted to keep peace within the household, often at the cost of her own voice. From an early age, Myra learned to adapt. She observed moods carefully, learned when to speak and when to remain silent, and adjusted her behavior to avoid conflict. This sensitivity made her perceptive, but it also taught her that love and safety were conditional. Approval had to be earned. Disapproval came swiftly. Emotional warmth was inconsistent, and as a result, she developed a deep need for validation, particularly from authority figures. As a child, she was described as intelligent, polite, and eager to please. Teachers saw potential in her. She performed well academically and showed signs of ambition. Unlike many of her peers, she took pride in appearance and presentation. She wanted to be seen as capable, respectable, and worthy of admiration. Beneath this, however, lay insecurity and a fear of rejection that quietly shaped her emotional world. Adolescence brought new complexities. Like many young people of the time, she struggled to define her identity within strict social boundaries. Gender roles were rigid, expectations were narrow, and emotional expression, especially for women, was carefully constrained. Independence was discouraged, yet quietly desired. In this tension, Myra began to crave significance. She wanted to matter, to be chosen, to feel important in a way that went beyond obedience or appearance. Her early relationships reflected this longing. She sought validation through attention, approval, and connection. Yet these relationships often left her feeling unseen or unfulfilled. There was a growing sense that she was searching for something undefined, something that would give her life meaning, direction, and purpose beyond the narrow options available to her. Unlike Ian Brady, her darkness did not emerge from intellectual detachment, but from emotional hunger. Where he withdrew inward, she reached outward. She wanted to be understood, admired, and emotionally anchored. This vulnerability did not make her weak, it made her receptive. And in certain circumstances, that receptivity would become dangerous. At work, she was known as diligent and capable. She took pride in being reliable, in doing things correctly. Her coworkers saw her as composed, polite, and unremarkable in the best sense of the word. There was nothing about her that suggested instability or danger. She fit seamlessly into her environment, much like Brady did in his own way. Two ordinary figures, moving through the same social landscape, yet carrying very different inner worlds. Emotionally, she lived with contradiction. She could be warm and engaging, yet distant, confident in appearance, yet deeply uncertain inside. She had learned to adapt to expectations rather than define her own desires. This made her highly responsive to influence, especially from those who projected certainty, authority, or intellectual confidence. The societal context of the time reinforced this vulnerability. Women were often encouraged to defer, to support, to follow rather than lead. Independence was admired in theory but discouraged in practice. For someone like Myra, who longed for direction and purpose, this environment made strong personalities deeply attractive. She was not drawn to chaos or rebellion. She was drawn to certainty, to conviction, to someone who appeared to understand the world in a way she did not. This longing would later shape her choices in ways she could not yet comprehend. It is important to understand that at this point in her life, there was no indication of the future that awaited her. She had not committed any wrongdoing. She had not crossed any moral boundaries. She was, in many ways, still forming, still searching for identity, belonging, and meaning. Her life had been defined by adaptation, not intention, yet the foundation was quietly being laid. Her emotional dependency, her desire for approval, her willingness to shape herself to another's expectations, all of these traits were forming beneath the surface. Alone, they meant little, but combined with the wrong influence, they would become something far more dangerous. As fate would have it, that influence was not far away. The paths of two individuals, one driven by control and detachment, the other by longing and submission, were slowly bending toward each other. Neither could yet see where those paths would lead, but the conditions were forming, quietly and inexorably, setting the stage for a union that would change everything. As Myra Hindley moved further into early adulthood, the contrast between her outward composure and her inner uncertainty grew more pronounced. To those around her, she appeared steady, capable, and dependable. She dressed neatly, spoke politely, and carried herself with quiet confidence. Yet beneath this calm exterior was a persistent sense of incompleteness, a feeling that she was still searching for something undefined, something that might finally give her life direction and meaning. By her late teens and early 20s, Myra had entered the working world, a place where structure offered comfort. Routine gave her a sense of purpose, and responsibility provided validation. She liked being seen as reliable, as someone who could be trusted. Praise mattered deeply to her, not for vanity, but because it filled an emotional gap that had existed since childhood. Each small affirmation felt like proof that she mattered. Yet even as she settled into adult life, she remained emotionally unanchored. Relationships never quite fulfilled her. She wanted intensity, connection, and emotional certainty, but struggled to define what those things truly meant. Her inner world was shaped by longing rather than clarity. This longing made her attentive, adaptable, and eager to please, traits that, in the wrong context, could be dangerously malleable. Socially, she was neither isolated nor especially outgoing. She existed in the middle ground, blending in easily. Friends and coworkers saw nothing unusual. She laughed, engaged in conversation, and participated in daily life without drawing attention. This normality would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of her story, the fact that nothing about her outward behavior hinted at the depths beneath. Emotionally, however, she was impressionable. Strong personalities fascinated her, especially those who spoke with conviction and authority. She admired confidence and intellect, particularly when paired with emotional intensity. These qualities promised stability, direction, and a sense of being chosen. To someone still searching for identity, such presence could feel magnetic. Her upbringing had taught her to equate approval with safety. Disagreement felt like rejection. As a result, she learned to adjust herself to others, often suppressing her own doubts in favor of harmony. This pattern made her susceptible to influence, especially from individuals who framed control as care or dominance as guidance. Despite this vulnerability, it is important to understand that Myra was not passive or unintelligent. She was perceptive and capable of independent thought, but her emotional needs often overrode her critical instincts. She wanted to belong to something greater than herself, to feel part of a shared purpose. That desire, powerful and human, would later be exploited in devastating ways at this stage in her life. However, nothing outwardly suggested danger. She was not violent, reckless, or unstable. She followed social norms and appeared grounded. The transformation that would later define her had not yet begun. What existed instead was potential, shaped by circumstance, longing, and environment. Psychologically, she was at a crossroads. She could have continued along a quiet, ordinary path, building a modest life defined by work, routine, and gradual self-discovery. Many people in similar positions do exactly that. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The social world around her was also shifting. Post-war Britain was changing, with traditional values slowly giving way to new ideas. Yet for many women, opportunities remained limited. Independence was encouraged in theory but constrained in practice. Emotional fulfillment was often expected to come through relationships rather than personal ambition. This cultural backdrop intensified her desire to be chosen, to be significant in someone else's world. That it was within this emotional landscape that she encountered Ian Brady. Their meeting did not feel dramatic or fated at first. There was no immediate sense of danger or transformation. Instead, there was recognition, a feeling of being seen and understood in a way she had not experienced before. Where others had offered familiarity, he offered intensity. Where others offered comfort, he offered purpose. That Brady's confidence and intellectual certainty drew her in. He spoke with authority, with conviction, and with a sense of knowing that contrasted sharply with her own uncertainty. To her, he seemed assured in a world that often felt confusing. He appeared to possess answers, not just to questions about life, but about identity itself. This connection did not begin with darkness. It began with conversation, curiosity, and a sense of mutual interest. Yet beneath this surface, subtle shifts were already occurring. Power dynamics began to form, though neither may have consciously recognized them at first. His influence grew gradually, woven into everyday interactions, shaping perspectives without force. What made this dynamic so powerful was its emotional resonance. Myra did not feel coerced. She felt chosen, seen, understood. In seeking connection, she began to orient herself around his worldview, slowly aligning her thoughts and values with his. This alignment did not happen overnight. It unfolded quietly, through trust, admiration, and emotional dependency. To be why the time she realized how deeply she had changed, the transformation was already well underway. Her sense of self had begun to merge with his influence, blurring boundaries she once held. The need for approval that had shaped her early life now found a focal point, and it would soon carry consequences beyond anything she could have imagined. This was the moment where two incomplete worlds began to merge, not through force or fear, but through emotional convergence. One driven by control and ideology, the other by longing and loyalty. Together, they would form a bond that history would come to know with horror. But at this moment, nothing seemed extraordinary. To the outside world, it was simply the beginning of a relationship. To history, It was the quiet prelude to tragedy. Chapter 4. When Two Worlds Collided. When Ian Brady and Myra Hindley first crossed paths, there was nothing outwardly dramatic about the moment. No sudden tension, no sense of fate announcing itself. It was ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of meeting that happens countless times in workplaces and public spaces. Yet history often begins quietly, without ceremony, and this meeting would become one of the most consequential intersections of two human lives in modern British history. They met in 1961 at MOORS, a chemical distribution company in Manchester where both were employed. The environment was unremarkable: desks, paperwork, routine conversations. It was the kind of place where people worked, exchanged pleasantries, and went home. Yet within this ordinary setting, something subtle began to shift. For Myra, Ian represented a presence unlike any she had encountered before. For Ian, she appeared receptive, attentive, and emotionally open in ways that intrigued him. Their early interactions were unremarkable on the surface. Conversations began casually, work-related exchanges, brief discussions, polite remarks. But beneath that surface, an unspoken dynamic was forming. Ian recognized in Myra a deep receptiveness, a desire to be understood, and a readiness to listen. Myra, in turn, sensed in Ian a certainty and intensity that felt grounding, even magnetic. He spoke with confidence, with conviction, and with an air of intellectual authority that drew her in. What made their connection powerful was not passion in the conventional sense, but alignment. They complemented one another psychologically. Ian's dominance found resonance in Myra's need for direction. Her emotional openness offered him a receptive audience for his ideas. Neither fully understood the implications of this dynamic, but both felt its pull. Ian began introducing Myra to his worldview gradually. Conversations deepened. He spoke of philosophy, morality, and human behavior with a certainty that left little room for doubt. He framed his perspectives not as opinions, but as truths uncovered through intellect. For Myra, who had long sought clarity and meaning, this was deeply compelling. She admired his confidence and absorbed his ideas with trust rather than skepticism. At first, these discussions seemed intellectual rather than dangerous. They explored abstract themes: power, human nature, individuality. Yet beneath the surface, these conversations were reshaping her internal compass. Ian did not impose his views forcefully. He allowed her to arrive at conclusions that aligned with his, making the influence feel self-directed rather than imposed. This subtle manipulation was key. It did not rely on fear or coercion, but on validation. He made her feel special, chosen, intellectually awakened. In his presence, she felt elevated above the ordinary world she had always known. This emotional reward strengthened her attachment and deepened her willingness to align with his perspective. As their relationship developed, the emotional balance shifted further. Myra became increasingly invested, emotionally dependent on his approval. Ian, meanwhile, grew more assured in his influence. He tested boundaries gradually, introducing darker ideas, gauging her reactions, observing how far he could go without resistance. Each step was calculated, each response carefully noted. What made this progression particularly dangerous was its subtlety. There was no clear moment where everything changed. Instead, it was a slow erosion of moral boundaries, softened by emotional connection. The extraordinary became normalized through repetition and reassurance. Doubt was reframed as weakness. Hesitation became something to overcome rather than heed. Outside their relationship, life continued as usual. Co-workers noticed little beyond a developing romance. Friends and acquaintances saw nothing alarming. Myra appeared more confident, more assured. Ian appeared stable and controlled. Their private world remained invisible to those around them. Yet within that private space, a psychological fusion was occurring. Ian's worldview became the framework through which Myra interpreted reality. Her sense of self increasingly revolved around his approval. What he believed, she came to believe. What he valued, she began to prioritize. The distinction between influence and identity blurred. This dynamic did not arise from sudden corruption, but from gradual adaptation. Human beings are remarkably capable of reshaping themselves in response to emotional bonds. When attachment intertwines with admiration and dependency, boundaries erode quietly. In this case, the erosion was nearly invisible from the outside as their bond strengthened. So did the isolation from external perspectives. Shared secrets created intimacy. Shared beliefs created loyalty. Together, they formed a self-contained emotional world, insulated from outside influence. In that world, Ian's authority grew, and Myra's sense of self became increasingly defined by her alignment with him. The early phase of their relationship was not marked by overt cruelty or violence. It was marked by intimacy, trust, and intellectual connection. That is what made it so dangerous. There was no clear warning sign, no moment that would have prompted alarm. Everything unfolded quietly, beneath the surface of everyday life. Yet this quiet was deceptive. Beneath it, something profound was taking shape, a partnership rooted not in mutual growth, but in imbalance. One mind seeking control, the other seeking belonging. Together, they were beginning to move toward a shared identity that neither could have fully anticipated alone. As the months passed, their connection deepened, and the world around them faded further into the background. The foundation had been laid. The transformation was underway, and though neither could yet see the full shape of what they were becoming, the direction was already set. This was the moment when two separate paths truly merged, not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. A convergence that would soon reshape lives, devastate families, and leave a mark on history that time itself would struggle to erase. As the relationship between Ian Brady and Myra Hindley deepened, it began to operate less like a partnership and more like a closed system, one shaped by influence, dependency, and quiet transformation. What made this phase especially unsettling was how ordinary it appeared from the outside. They worked, socialized when necessary, and moved through daily routines without drawing attention. Yet beneath that surface, their inner world was changing rapidly. Ian's influence became more deliberate. He began to test boundaries with subtlety, introducing ideas not as commands, but as intellectual exercises. He framed his beliefs as enlightened thinking, positioning himself as someone who saw through social illusions. This approach allowed him to guide rather than force. Myra, eager to understand and belong, absorbed these ideas with growing trust. Over time, her internal moral compass began to shift, recalibrated by his logic and approval. What made this transformation especially powerful was the emotional reinforcement that accompanied it. When Myra echoed his thoughts or adopted his viewpoints, she was rewarded with affirmation. When she hesitated or expressed uncertainty, he withdrew emotionally, creating a quiet but powerful incentive to align herself with him. This cycle deepened her dependence, reinforcing the idea that closeness and approval were contingent on agreement. Gradually, her sense of individuality blurred. She began to see the world through his lens, interpreting events according to his frameworks. Doubt, once a natural response, became something to suppress. Questions became signs of weakness. In this environment, critical thinking gave way to emotional loyalty. She was no longer simply learning from him. She was reshaping herself to fit within his worldview. This process was not sudden or violent. It unfolded over time, woven into everyday interactions. Shared conversations became shared beliefs. Shared beliefs became shared identity. The transformation was subtle enough that Myra herself may not have recognized it as such. To her, it felt like growth, like becoming more complete. Meanwhile, Ian's sense of control intensified. He took satisfaction in his ability to influence her thoughts and actions. This reinforcement strengthened his belief in his own intellectual and moral superiority. He did not see their relationship as equal. He saw it as evidence of his dominance. Yet he maintained a calm, measured exterior, rarely revealing the extent of his internal certainty. Their bond increasingly isolated them from others. Social interactions became less frequent, less meaningful. Outsiders were viewed as shallow, uncomprehending, or irrelevant. This isolation further strengthened their reliance on one another. In their shared world, they were insulated from contradiction, free to reinforce their beliefs without challenge. This period marked a critical shift, the transition from influence to collaboration. Myra was no longer simply absorbing ideas. She was beginning to participate in their reinforcement. She supported his views, defended them, and gradually internalized them as her own. The emotional dependency had evolved into ideological alignment. It is important to understand that this transformation did not stem from overt coercion. It was built on trust, intimacy, and emotional investment. That is what made it so effective and so dangerous. When belief systems form within close emotional bonds, they can override instinct, morality, and self-preservation. As their connection deepened, they began spending more time together away from work. Long conversations stretched into late hours. They discussed philosophy, society, and the nature of power. These discussions were not abstract. They were personal. They reinforced a shared sense of separation from the world, a belief that they stood apart from ordinary people. This growing isolation created an echo chamber. Ideas were no longer challenged, only refined. The absence of external perspectives allowed their shared worldview to harden. What once might have seemed extreme became normalized through repetition and mutual reinforcement. Throughout this period, there were no outward signs of the devastation to come. Friends and acquaintances saw a couple growing closer, perhaps unusually private, but not alarming. There were no visible warnings, no dramatic behavioral changes. Everything unfolded quietly, shielded by the appearance of normalcy. Yet internally, something irreversible was taking shape. The emotional bond between them had become a conduit for transformation, one that would soon extend beyond thought into action. The foundation for what would follow was being laid, not through force or chaos, but through connection, influence, and shared belief. This phase of their relationship represents a crucial turning point. It was here that individuality began to dissolve, replaced by a unified identity built on imbalance and control. It was here that moral boundaries quietly eroded, making room for actions that once would have been unimaginable as time passed. Their bond solidified into something closed and self-sustaining. They no longer needed the outside world for validation or meaning. They had each other, and in that closeness, they found a sense of purpose that felt absolute. The world beyond their private sphere remained unaware. Life went on as usual. Streets filled with familiar sounds. Routines continued uninterrupted, and trust remained intact. Yet beneath this calm surface, the trajectory had shifted irrevocably. What began as a meeting between two individuals had evolved into a shared identity, one shaped by control, dependence, and distorted belief. The quiet before the storm was nearing its end, and as their bond deepened further, the line between thought and action began to blur. Chapter 5. The Birth of a Dark Partnership. By the time Brady and Myra Hindley's relationship reached its next stage, something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. What began as emotional alignment had quietly transformed into something more powerful, a shared sense of purpose. Their bond no longer rested solely on affection or intellectual exchange. It had become a private universe, governed by its own rules, insulated from moral challenge, and sustained by mutual reinforcement. This phase did not announce itself through sudden change. Instead, it unfolded through small, almost imperceptible steps. Their conversations grew more insular, more focused on abstract ideas about humanity, control, and identity. The world beyond them felt increasingly distant, even irrelevant. In this private mental space, they were no longer simply two individuals in a relationship. They were collaborators in thought, reinforcing each other's evolving perspectives. What made this period particularly dangerous was the illusion of equality. On the surface, it appeared as though both were contributing equally to their shared worldview. In reality, the balance of influence remained uneven. Ian continued to guide the direction of their thinking, subtly framing ideas in ways that encouraged compliance rather than reflection. Myra, seeking closeness and affirmation, absorbed these ideas without resistance. Her loyalty deepened, and with it, her willingness to align herself fully with his outlook. This was not a sudden surrender of autonomy. It was a gradual adjustment, a slow internal shift where questioning gave way to acceptance, and acceptance gradually turned into belief. She began to adopt his language, his interpretations, his sense of moral distance. What once might have seemed disturbing began to feel abstract, theoretical, removed from real-world consequence. Their shared isolation intensified this process. They increasingly withdrew from social circles, choosing each other's company over all else. The outside world, with its expectations and moral boundaries, felt intrusive. Within their private space, they were free from judgment. This isolation did not feel lonely, it felt exclusive. They believed they had found something rare, a connection that transcended conventional norms. The emotional dynamic between them also evolved. Ian's need for control found fulfillment in Myra's willingness to follow. Her need for affirmation found fulfillment in his approval. This mutual reinforcement created a closed loop, one that strengthened with each interaction. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish where one ended and the other began. What is striking is how ordinary their daily lives still appeared. They went to work, interacted politely with colleagues, and maintained routines that mirrored those of countless others. There were no outward signs of instability or danger. This normalcy served as camouflage, allowing their inner transformation to go unnoticed. During this period, conversations between them grew darker in tone, though still cloaked in abstraction. They spoke about human nature, power, and moral boundaries in detached, intellectual terms. These discussions were not framed as plans, but as explorations. Yet repeated exposure to such ideas gradually reshaped their emotional responses. What once might have triggered discomfort began to feel distant, even theoretical. This emotional distancing was crucial. It allowed them to contemplate ideas without engaging empathy. By discussing human suffering as an abstract concept, they removed themselves from its emotional reality. Over time, this desensitization became normalized within their shared world. For Myra, this shift was particularly significant. Her earlier desire for belonging had now evolved into loyalty. She felt chosen, valued, and integral to something larger than herself. The sense of purpose this provided was powerful. It gave her identity, direction, and emotional security, even as it quietly eroded her moral foundation. Ian, meanwhile, grew more assured in his influence. He observed how easily her perspectives aligned with his own and drew confidence from it. This validation reinforced his belief in his intellectual and psychological superiority. He saw their connection as proof of his ability to shape another mind, a confirmation of his worldview. Yet it is important to recognize that this transformation did not occur in isolation from broader societal factors. The era's limited understanding of psychological manipulation, combined with rigid social norms, meant that warning signs were easily overlooked. Emotional dependence was often mistaken for devotion. Control was misinterpreted as confidence. Silence was seen as stability. As their partnership deepened, they began to spend increasing amounts of time alone together. These moments were not marked by chaos or conflict, but by quiet intensity. Their conversations became rituals, reinforcing shared beliefs and strengthening emotional bonds. The outside world faded further into irrelevance. This stage marked the true beginning of their shared path, not defined by actions, but by intention. A psychological alignment had formed, one that would soon guide their choices in ways neither could fully reverse. The groundwork had been laid for a partnership rooted not in mutual growth, but in mutual distortion. What makes this phase so unsettling is its subtlety. There were no dramatic turning points, no sudden transformations. Everything unfolded gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. This is often how profound harm begins, not with chaos, but with connection. By the end of this chapter in their lives, the foundation was firmly set. Two individuals, bound by influence and dependency, stood at the threshold of something far darker than either had previously known. The world around them remained unaware, moving forward in ordinary rhythm, while beneath the surface, a dangerous alignment had taken hold. The path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was forming with quiet inevitability, shaped by shared belief, emotional fusion, and the absence of restraint. As the bond between Ian Brady and Myra Hindley deepened, it began to reshape not only how they viewed the world, but how they viewed themselves within it. What had once felt like shared curiosity slowly hardened into shared conviction. Their private conversations, once exploratory, became increasingly declarative. Ideas were no longer questioned, they were affirmed. What began as influence had matured into alignment, and alignment was quietly transforming into intent. Their emotional closeness intensified during this period. They spent long stretches of time together, often retreating from wider social contact. This isolation did not feel like withdrawal to them. It felt like clarity. In each other, they believed they had found understanding absent elsewhere. The world beyond their shared space felt shallow, constrained by rules they now believed no longer applied to them. Ian's role within the relationship continued to solidify. He spoke with authority, framing his worldview as intellectually superior. He presented himself as someone who had transcended conventional morality, someone who saw truth where others remained blind. Myra, deeply invested in the relationship, absorbed these ideas with growing conviction. She trusted his certainty more than her own doubts. Over time, doubt itself became something to suppress. This shift did not happen abruptly. It unfolded through repetition, affirmation, and emotional reward. Each time she aligned with his thinking, she felt closer to him. Each time she questioned it, distance followed. The pattern became clear, even if unspoken. Approval was earned through agreement. Belonging required alignment. What made this transformation particularly insidious was that it felt like growth. Myra believed she was becoming more aware, more enlightened. The discomfort that occasionally surfaced was reframed as weakness or fear, obstacles to overcome rather than signals to heed. This internal reframing allowed her to move further away from her own moral instincts without fully realizing it. Meanwhile, Ian's sense of control deepened. He was no longer merely influencing, he was shaping. The emotional bond between them had become a tool through which he could guide thought and behavior. He did not need to command, suggestion was enough. This dynamic reinforced his sense of dominance and intellectual superiority, confirming beliefs he had long held about himself. As their shared worldview solidified, the boundaries between imagination and reality began to blur. Ideas that once existed only in discussion started to feel more tangible, more possible, not because they were acted upon, but because they were no longer dismissed. The mere act of contemplating them without moral resistance shifted their psychological weight. Their conversations grew more intense, more insular. They spoke less about everyday life and more about abstract notions of power, control, and detachment. These discussions were not overtly violent, but they were emotionally cold. Human suffering became an abstract concept, stripped of context or consequence. This emotional distancing laid the groundwork for future actions. Even if those actions had not yet taken shape, the outside world continued on, unaware. Friends, co-workers, and acquaintances saw nothing unusual. The couple appeared calm, composed, even affectionate. There were no outward signs of instability or malice. This normalcy became a protective mask, allowing their internal transformation to continue uninterrupted. At this stage, the relationship had become self-reinforcing. Each partner validated the other's worldview, creating a closed loop of belief. External perspectives were dismissed as naive or irrelevant. Moral boundaries, once defined by society, were replaced by personal justification. This was not rebellion, it was redefinition. What is crucial to understand is that this transformation did not feel wrong to them. It felt coherent. It felt logical. It felt like clarity. This is how deeply destructive ideologies often take root. Not through chaos, but through calm conviction that Myra's identity, once shaped by a desire for acceptance, had now fused with Ian's sense of purpose. She no longer saw herself as separate. Her self-worth became entwined with his approval and their shared worldview. In this fusion, personal responsibility began to dissolve. Actions were no longer hers or his alone. They belonged to the identity they had constructed together. The emotional intensity of their bond also created a sense of inevitability. They began to see themselves as set apart from the rest of society, bound by a connection others could not understand. This belief reinforced their isolation and justified their detachment. The more isolated they became, the more absolute their bond felt. This period marked the final stage before a critical shift. The psychological groundwork had been laid. Beliefs had hardened. Boundaries had eroded. What remained was a partnership defined not by love in its healthy form, but by dependency, dominance, and shared distortion. The world around them remained unaware. Streets bustled. Lives continued. No alarms sounded. Yet beneath the surface, a transformation had reached its point of no return. What followed would not emerge suddenly or dramatically. It would grow from this foundation, quietly, deliberately, and with devastating consequence. The partnership that had formed was no longer merely emotional or ideological. It was becoming something far more dangerous. And as the final barriers of restraint weakened, the path ahead narrowed, guiding them toward actions that would forever alter countless lives. Chapter 6. The first line crossed. There is a moment in every descent when thought begins to transform into action. It is not always sudden, nor is it always loud. Often, it arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, wrapped in rationalization and emotional certainty. For Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, that moment did not come with chaos or confrontation. It arrived through a gradual erosion of restraint, shaped by belief, loyalty, and a shared sense of separation from the world around them. By this point in their relationship, the boundary between imagination and intention had begun to thin. Their conversations, once philosophical and abstract, now carried a heavier weight. Ideas were no longer just discussed, they were mentally rehearsed. The emotional distance they had cultivated toward others made it easier to conceptualize actions without fully acknowledging their consequences. This was not impulsive behavior. It was methodical, internal, and disturbingly calm. What made this transition especially dangerous was the absence of alarm. There was no internal panic, no moral crisis that forced reflection. Instead, there was a growing sense of inevitability. Their shared worldview had created a framework in which certain actions no longer felt unthinkable. The line between right and wrong had not been crossed suddenly. It had faded gradually, until it was barely visible at all. In this phase, their bond deepened further. They spent long periods together, increasingly isolated from outside influences. This isolation reinforced their beliefs and eliminated opportunities for external reality to challenge their thinking. Without contrast, their ideas felt coherent, even justified. Each reinforced the other's sense of purpose, creating a closed system where doubt had no place. Myra's transformation during this time was particularly profound. Her earlier need for approval had evolved into a deeper identification with Ian's worldview. She no longer questioned his ideas, she internalized them. Her loyalty was no longer emotional alone. It had become ideological. She saw herself as part of something meaningful, something that transcended ordinary moral boundaries. Ian, in turn, found validation in her alignment. Her acceptance confirmed his belief in his own intellectual authority. It strengthened his conviction that his understanding of the world was superior to conventional morality. This mutual reinforcement created a psychological environment in which restraint felt unnecessary and doubt felt like weakness. The danger of this stage lies in its subtlety. There were no dramatic declarations or visible shifts. Instead, small decisions accumulated quietly, each one reinforcing the next. The threshold of what felt acceptable slowly expanded. What once would have provoked discomfort now felt abstract. Emotional distance made it easier to detach from the real-world implications of thought. Importantly, this transformation did not occur in isolation from everyday life. They continued to function outwardly as ordinary individuals. They worked, interacted with others, and maintained appearances. This normalcy masked the internal shift taking place, allowing it to progress unchecked. To anyone observing from the outside, there was no obvious sign that anything had changed. The emotional dynamic between them also evolved. Their bond became less about affection and more about alignment. They reinforced each other's beliefs through shared language, shared silences, and shared understanding. In this environment, hesitation was interpreted as weakness and empathy as an obstacle to clarity. Over time, this reframing became second nature. It is important to understand that this stage was not driven by chaos or loss of control. On the contrary, it was characterized by a sense of calm focus. The absence of emotional turbulence made their thinking feel rational, even disciplined. This illusion of control was one of the most dangerous aspects of their transformation. As their internal world grew more rigid, their perception of others grew increasingly abstract. People outside their bond were no longer seen as individuals with inner lives, but as distant figures, largely irrelevant to their internal narrative. This emotional distancing made it easier to contemplate actions without fully engaging with their human impact. Yet, even at this stage, nothing outwardly signaled the gravity of what was unfolding. There were no dramatic confrontations, no visible breakdowns. Life continued in its familiar rhythm. The world moved on, unaware that a critical line had been crossed, not through action, but through intention. This is often how the most devastating changes begin. Not with chaos, but with quiet certainty. Not with hatred, but with detachment. When empathy fades gradually, its absence can go unnoticed until it is too late. By the end of this period, something irreversible had occurred. The internal safeguards that once guided moral judgment had weakened beyond repair. The shared identity they had built now carried within it the potential for harm. The path ahead was no longer theoretical. It was forming, step by step, shaped by belief, loyalty, and the absence of restraint. The world outside remained unchanged, unaware of the shift that had taken place beneath its surface. But within the private sphere they had created, a threshold had been crossed, one that could not be undone. And as that threshold faded behind them, the consequences of their alignment began to move from thought into reality. As the internal world shared by Brady and Myra Hindley grew more insular, the distance between thought and action narrowed further. This shift did not happen in a single moment of realization, but through a gradual numbing of emotional response. What once might have felt morally unthinkable now existed in a neutral space, neither right nor wrong, simply possible. That quiet shift marked the most dangerous phase of all.at this stage. Their connection had evolved beyond emotional dependence into something more fused. They no longer saw themselves as separate individuals navigating life side by side. Instead, they began to function as a single psychological unit. Decisions were no longer personal choices, but shared conclusions. Responsibility became blurred, diffused between them, making it easier for each to relinquish personal accountability. This fusion created a powerful sense of unity. They reinforced one another's beliefs, validating perceptions that, in isolation, might have raised internal alarms. Together, however, those alarms fell silent. The very act of sharing thoughts gave them legitimacy. In this closed loop, agreement replaced reflection, and affirmation replaced conscience. What made this stage especially perilous was the emotional calm that accompanied it. There was no inner turmoil, no dramatic moral struggle. Instead, there was clarity, an unsettling calm that allowed thoughts to settle without resistance. This emotional quietness created the illusion of control, as though they were operating from reason rather than impulse. Their conversations continued to explore ideas about power, control, and detachment, but now those ideas felt closer to lived reality. The emotional distance they had cultivated toward others allowed them to discuss human suffering in abstract terms. People became concepts rather than individuals. This abstraction dulled empathy, making it easier to contemplate actions without emotional consequence. Throughout this period, they remained outwardly unremarkable. They laughed, worked, and moved through public spaces without attracting attention. This contrast between their inner world and outward appearance made their transformation nearly invisible. It is often in such quiet duality that the most profound changes occur. The absence of external challenge played a critical role. No one questioned their behavior. No one noticed subtle shifts in attitude or tone. Their isolation protected them, reinforcing the belief that their understanding of the world was superior. Without contradiction, Belief hardens into certainty as their internal alignment deepened. So did their emotional detachment from others. Compassion became conceptual rather than felt. Concern for others' well-being existed only in theory. This emotional distancing allowed them to perceive themselves as separate from the moral expectations governing ordinary people. In this state, the idea of consequence lost its weight, not because they denied it, but because it felt irrelevant. Their shared worldview framed them as observers rather than participants in moral systems. This psychological separation made it possible to imagine crossing lines without experiencing internal resistance. It is important to understand that this transformation was not driven by chaos or emotional instability. On the contrary, it was marked by calm focus. Their conversations were measured, deliberate, and controlled. This sense of composure reinforced the illusion that they were acting rationally, even thoughtfully. At this point, the final internal barrier began to erode, the belief that certain actions were simply unthinkable. Once that belief weakened, the boundary between contemplation and action became dangerously thin. What had once existed only as abstract thought now felt within reach. Yet even as this shift occurred, there was no dramatic turning point. No moment of panic or realization. The change was incremental, almost invisible. This is often how moral collapse unfolds, not through a single catastrophic decision, but through a series of small, seemingly insignificant steps. The world around them remained unaware. People continued their lives, unaware of the psychological transformation taking place behind closed doors. There were no warning signs dramatic enough to draw attention. The quietness of it all made it easier for the process to continue unchecked. This stage marked the final erosion of internal restraint. The mental framework that once distinguished thought from action had weakened beyond repair. The bond between them now functioned as both justification and shield. In their shared understanding, they found validation that overrode conscience. What followed would not be sudden or chaotic. It would emerge from this carefully constructed internal world, shaped by months of emotional alignment and intellectual reinforcement. The step from thought to action, once unimaginable, now seemed almost natural. The tragedy of this moment lies not only in what would come next, but in how easily it unfolded. No dramatic warning, no visible descent, just a quiet crossing of an invisible line. And once crossed, there would be no return. Chapter 7. The Moors, a landscape of silence. The moors stretched endlessly across the northern landscape, quiet and indifferent, shaped by wind, time, and isolation. To many, they were places of beauty, wide open skies, rolling earth, and a stillness that invited reflection. To others, they were desolate and unsettling, places where sound seemed to vanish and direction could easily be lost. Long before they became associated with tragedy, the moors existed as they always had, vast, empty, and emotionally neutral. They did not judge. They did not remember. They simply endured. For Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the moors became something else entirely. They were not chosen for their beauty, but for their silence. Their remoteness offered privacy, distance from scrutiny, and a sense of detachment from the structured world they had begun to reject. The land did not speak back. It did not interrupt thought or challenge intention. It absorbed everything without response. The appeal of the moors lay in their emotional neutrality. There were no crowds, no witnesses, no reminders of social norms. The vast openness paradoxically created a sense of concealment. Sounds disappeared into the wind. Footprints faded into the earth. In this environment, the boundaries between imagination and reality grew thin. It was a place where the mind could wander unchecked. For Brady, The Moors represented control through isolation. He understood the psychological power of emptiness, how silence could amplify thought and suppress doubt. In such spaces, ideas felt larger, more absolute. The absence of distraction allowed internal narratives to dominate. It was here that his sense of authority and detachment found physical expression. For Hindley, the Moors carried a different emotional weight. They were unfamiliar yet compelling, vast yet strangely intimate when shared with someone she trusted. Being there with Brady deepened her sense of connection to him. The isolation intensified their bond, reinforcing the feeling that they existed in a world apart from everyone else. The landscape itself became part of their shared experience. The cold air, the open sky, the long stretches of quiet, all of it reinforced the separation they felt from ordinary life. The Moors did not feel like a place to visit. They felt like a boundary between worlds. On one side was society, expectation, and restraint. On the other was a private realm shaped by their shared perceptions. As they spent more time in these spaces, the Moors became woven into their psychological landscape. They were no longer just physical locations, but symbols of detachment and control. In the absence of witnesses, thoughts could unfold without consequence. This freedom, however, carried a hidden cost: the erosion of moral grounding. The stillness of the Moors encouraged introspection, but not the kind that fosters empathy. Instead, it amplified isolation. Human presence felt distant and abstract. In this environment, people became ideas rather than individuals. This emotional distancing made it easier to separate thought from consequence. Importantly, nothing about the Moors was inherently sinister. Their danger lay in how they were used, as spaces where accountability dissolved and imagination went unchecked. Nature itself remained indifferent, neither guiding nor judging. It simply existed, offering silence to those who sought it. As Brady and Hindley continued to visit these remote areas, the boundary between inner thought and external reality continued to blur. The landscape mirrored their internal state, vast, quiet, and increasingly detached from human connection. The more time they spent there, the more natural it felt to be removed from the structures of ordinary life. In these moments, the world beyond the Moors seemed distant and irrelevant. Daily routines, moral expectations, and social norms felt like abstractions belonging to another existence. Within the stillness, their shared identity deepened. The silence reinforced their belief that they were separate, different, and somehow beyond the reach of ordinary judgment. The Moors also provided a sense of permanence. Unlike people, they did not change or question. This permanence offered a strange comfort, a backdrop against which thoughts could unfold without resistance. In a world that often felt uncertain, the unchanging landscape offered stability, a fixed point around which their inner world could revolve. As their association with the Moors deepened, so too did the symbolic weight of the place. It became a setting where internal boundaries dissolved, where imagination felt unrestrained. The quiet allowed ideas to linger longer, to settle more deeply, to feel more real. This stage of their journey marked a significant shift. The environment itself had become a participant in their psychological transformation. The Moors were no longer just a location. They were an extension of their inner world, vast, silent, and detached. The danger of this transformation lay in its subtlety. Nothing dramatic occurred. There were no visible warning signs. The world beyond the Moors continued as usual, unaware that something profound was unfolding in its margins. As they walked across the open land, surrounded by wind and sky, they moved further away from the structures that once grounded them. Each step carried them deeper into isolation, deeper into a shared reality shaped by silence. And in that silence, the final barriers between thought and action continued to erode. As time passed, the moors became more than a backdrop to Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's shared world. They became a psychological threshold. Each visit reinforced a sense of separation from ordinary life, a feeling that the rules governing society no longer applied in this vast, silent place. The land did not question them. It did not respond. It simply absorbed their presence, reinforcing the illusion that they existed beyond consequence. In this environment, their thoughts seemed to expand. Silence has a way of amplifying the inner voice, and here there was nothing to interrupt it. Without distraction, ideas lingered longer. Emotions settled into stillness. What might once have felt unsettling became strangely normalized. The quiet allowed them to sit with their thoughts until those thoughts no longer felt foreign. This is how isolation often reshapes perception. When the external world grows distant, the internal world becomes dominant. For Brady and Hindley, the moors functioned as a psychological mirror, reflecting back the narratives they had built together. Their shared beliefs felt more real in this space, less subject to contradiction. The absence of others removed friction, allowing their internal logic to flow uninterrupted. The landscape also offered anonymity. There were no observers, no expectations, no social cues to regulate behavior. In such isolation, the usual boundaries that guide human conduct weaken. Without an audience, actions feel less defined by consequence. This sense of invisibility can quietly distort judgment, especially when combined with emotional detachment. What made the moors particularly significant was their ability to normalize silence. Silence can be peaceful, but it can also be permissive. It allows thoughts to echo without interruption, to repeat until they feel justified. Over time, this repetition can dull emotional response. The mind adapts, reshaping its thresholds for discomfort. For Myra, the moors became intertwined with her emotional bond to Ian. Being there with him reinforced her sense of belonging. The shared solitude felt intimate, almost sacred. It deepened her emotional investment, making her more willing to accept his worldview without question. In that space, his certainty felt grounding, even reassuring. For Ian, the moors reinforced his sense of control. The vastness mirrored his internal detachment, offering a physical expression of the distance he felt from others. The environment allowed him to feel unobserved and unrestrained, strengthening his belief that he operated beyond conventional limits. Together, they began to associate the landscape with their shared identity. It became a place where their bond felt strongest, where the outside world seemed irrelevant. This association further deepened their emotional isolation, reinforcing the idea that they existed apart from society. The danger of such isolation lies in its subtlety. It does not announce itself as harmful. It feels calm, even grounding. But in that calm, the mechanisms that normally regulate behavior begin to weaken. Without contrast or challenge, beliefs solidify unchecked. As their time on the moors continued, the emotional distance between them and the rest of humanity widened. People became abstractions, distant figures with no emotional weight. Empathy, once a natural response, faded into something theoretical. The emotional cues that guide moral judgment grew faint. This transformation did not occur in moments of intensity, but in long stretches of quiet. The wind, the open land, the silence, all contributed to a sense of detachment that felt almost meditative. In that state, the line between imagination and reality blurred further. Importantly, this was not a descent marked by chaos or agitation. It was marked by stillness. That stillness allowed harmful ideas to settle without resistance. It allowed rationalization to replace empathy. It allowed intention to form without emotional consequence. The moors became a place where thought could exist without friction. And when thought exists without challenge, it can take on a dangerous sense of inevitability. What once felt hypothetical began to feel possible. What once felt distant began to feel close. Yet even as this internal shift took place, the outside world remained unchanged. People went about their lives, unaware of the transformation unfolding beyond the edges of their awareness. There were no warnings, no disruptions. Life continued, ordinary and predictable. This contrast between the calm of everyday life and the growing darkness within the isolated world of Brady and Hindley is what makes this period so unsettling. It reminds us how easily profound changes can occur unnoticed, how quietly boundaries can dissolve. The Moors, silent and unmoving, bore witness to this transformation without judgment. They did not cause it, nor did they prevent it. They simply existed, offering space for thoughts to deepen and identities to shift. By the end of this period, something irreversible had taken root. The emotional distance from humanity had widened. The internal justifications had solidified, and the path ahead, though still unseen, had narrowed. The stillness that once felt peaceful now carried weight. The silence had become heavy with meaning. And within that silence, the final steps toward irreversible actions were beginning to form. Chapter 8. The Hidden Lives They Lived. To the outside world, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley appeared unremarkable, two ordinary people moving through ordinary routines. This duality, the contrast between appearance and reality, is one of the most unsettling elements of their story. While their inner world had grown increasingly detached and insular, their outward lives remained calm, predictable, and socially acceptable. This separation allowed them to exist in two worlds at once, neither fully touching the other. By day, they moved through familiar environments, workplaces, streets, shops, conversations that carried no hint of the darkness beneath. Their interactions were polite, controlled, and largely unremarkable. To neighbors and colleagues, they were simply another couple navigating everyday life. There were no dramatic warning signs, no visible fractures in behavior. They blended into the background of ordinary routines with ease. This ability to compartmentalize was central to how their inner world remained concealed. Compartmentalization allowed them to isolate thoughts, emotions, and intentions from outward behavior. What they thought and felt privately did not surface in their public interactions. This psychological separation allowed them to function without drawing attention, even as their internal world grew increasingly detached from social norms. For Myra, this dual existence required careful emotional management. She learned to present warmth, reliability, and composure while suppressing inner conflict. Her ability to switch between emotional states became second nature. At work and among acquaintances, she fulfilled expectations with ease. Behind closed doors, however, her identity increasingly revolved around her connection to Ian and the shared reality they had constructed. Ian, too, maintained his outward composure. His demeanor remained calm, controlled, and intellectually composed. He appeared thoughtful rather than volatile, reserved rather than threatening. This external restraint concealed a deeply internalized sense of detachment. He did not experience the tension that might expose contradiction. Instead, he lived comfortably within it. Their lives unfolded in parallel layers. On the surface was routine, schedules, conversations, familiar patterns. Beneath that was a private world shaped by shared beliefs and emotional alignment. The separation between these layers allowed each to exist without disturbing the other. This compartmentalization is often what allows harmful trajectories to continue unnoticed. Importantly, there was no constant sense of fear or urgency in their day-to-day lives. The calmness of their routine reinforced the illusion that everything was normal. This absence of disruption made it easier to ignore internal dissonance. Without external pressure, their private world grew stronger, more defined, and more insulated. Social interactions during this time were largely superficial. Conversations stayed within acceptable boundaries. Emotional depth was carefully controlled. This emotional restraint created a protective shell, preventing others from glimpsing what lay beneath. Even those who knew them reasonably well saw nothing that demanded concern at the same time. The contrast between public and private selves deepened their sense of separation from society. The more they maintained this dual existence, the more distinct their internal world became. They began to view themselves as observers rather than participants in everyday life. Society became something to navigate, not belong to. This growing detachment altered their perception of responsibility. When one exists emotionally apart from others, the impact of one's actions becomes abstract. Accountability feels distant. The emotional weight that normally anchors moral behavior weakens. In this way, isolation does not merely hide intent, it reshapes it. The structure of their daily lives reinforced this detachment. Routine provided stability without introspection. Familiar patterns reduced the need for reflection. Over time, this rhythm normalized their internal world, making it feel consistent and justified. It is important to understand that nothing about this phase appeared dramatic or alarming. The danger lay precisely in its ordinariness. Harmful transformation does not always announce itself with chaos. Often, it grows quietly, hidden within routine and habit. Their ability to move seamlessly between two realities also reinforced their sense of control. They believed they could navigate both worlds without consequence. This belief fostered a subtle sense of superiority, a feeling of being separate from the rules that governed others. In this way, their hidden lives became a form of psychological shelter. Within it, they could explore thoughts and identities that would never survive scrutiny in the outside world. The secrecy itself became reinforcing, strengthening their bond and deepening their sense of exclusivity. As time passed, this dual existence became increasingly difficult to disentangle. The line between public persona and private identity blurred. The internal world grew more dominant, quietly reshaping perception and judgment. The danger of such a transformation lies not in overt malice, but in gradual disengagement from shared reality. When people live divided lives, accountability weakens. Empathy fades. Responsibility becomes abstract. By this point, the foundations were firmly in place. The separation between who they appeared to be and who they were becoming had grown wide enough to conceal nearly anything. The world around them remained unaware, moving forward in ordinary rhythms. And beneath that calm exterior, the weight of what they were becoming continued to grow, unseen, unchecked, and drawing ever closer to irreversible consequence. As their double existence continued, the contrast between appearance and reality grew sharper, yet paradoxically easier for them to maintain. Living two lives no longer felt deceptive, it felt natural. The outer world, with its routines and expectations, became a kind of stage. The inner world, shaped by secrecy and shared belief, felt more authentic to them than anything else. This psychological split allowed them to move forward without internal conflict. Even as their sense of moral grounding continued to erode, one of the most unsettling aspects of this phase was how functional everything appeared. They were not isolated in the way people often imagine danger to look. They worked, spoke politely, and fulfilled daily obligations. They laughed at the right moments, listened when expected, and participated just enough to avoid attention. Their ability to perform normalcy became a shield, one that concealed not chaos, but careful control. This ability to switch between emotional states gave them a sense of mastery. They believed they understood how society functioned and how easily it could be navigated. Rules felt negotiable. Expectations felt optional. The more they succeeded in maintaining this duality, the more confident they became in their ability to manage it indefinitely. For Myra, this period marked a deepening internal shift. Her identity became increasingly intertwined with the private world she shared with Ian. The person she presented to others felt distant, almost artificial. Her emotional authenticity lived elsewhere, within the closed system of their relationship. This made her more dependent on that connection, as it had become the primary source of meaning in her life. Ian, meanwhile, appeared increasingly self-assured. The absence of consequences reinforced his belief that he operated beyond ordinary limits. His sense of control extended not only over their shared world, but over how others perceived him. This reinforced a dangerous internal narrative that intelligence and composure could override accountability. Their shared routines strengthened this belief. Ordinary activities, meals, travel, casual conversation took on a strange dual quality. Outwardly mundane, inwardly detached. This disconnect allowed them to move through daily life without confronting the emotional weight of their thoughts. It also normalized the separation between action and empathy. What made this stage particularly unsettling was how quiet it was. There were no arguments, no visible crises, no dramatic turning points. The absence of conflict gave the illusion of stability. In reality, it was the calm before an irreversible shift. The human mind adapts quickly to patterns. When behavior goes unchallenged, it becomes easier to repeat. For Brady and Hindley, the absence of resistance, from others and from within, allowed their internal narrative to solidify. The longer they lived this way, the more difficult it became to imagine any alternative. The outside world continued, unaware. People passed them in the street without a second thought. Conversations remained superficial, polite, forgettable. This invisibility reinforced their sense of separation. They were among others, yet apart from them. Observers rather than participants that I in this state. Empathy faded not through cruelty, but through neglect. It was not actively suppressed, it was simply unused. Over time, unused capacities weaken. Emotional responsiveness dulled. Human suffering became an abstraction rather than a lived reality. This detachment made it easier to rationalize actions that would once have felt impossible. Without emotional resonance, moral boundaries lose their force. Actions become ideas. Ideas become possibilities. Possibilities become acceptable. It is important to understand that this shift did not involve dramatic emotional collapse. There were no violent impulses erupting into consciousness. Instead, there was a quiet narrowing of perspective, a gradual withdrawal from the emotional fabric that binds people to one another. The danger of this stage lies in its subtlety. There is no clear moment to point to and say, "This is when it began." It is a slow drift, almost imperceptible, until one realizes how far they have traveled. Why now? Their internal world had become more real to them than the external one. Their bond felt self-sustaining, self-justifying. Outside influence seemed unnecessary, even intrusive. This psychological isolation allowed their shared worldview to harden without challenge. The hidden lives they lived were not chaotic or outwardly disturbed. They were calm, ordered, and disturbingly coherent. That coherence gave them confidence, and that confidence, in turn, allowed them to move forward without hesitation. The transformation was nearly complete. The distance between thought and action had narrowed to a fragile line. What remained was not uncertainty, but quiet readiness. Soon, the invisible world they had built would begin to shape the visible one. The separation between inner belief and outer reality would collapse, and when that happened, the consequences would reach far beyond the silence that had sheltered them for so long. Chapter 9: Voices that went unheard. Behind every historical tragedy lies a quieter truth. The lives that existed before they were overshadowed by events beyond their control. Before the names of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley became fixed in public memory, there were others whose stories were still unfolding, whose futures were unwritten, whose voices carried hopes, fears, and ordinary dreams. These voices were not loud. They did not demand attention. And that, tragically, is why they were so easily lost in the Britain of the early 1960s. Childhood and adolescence unfolded within a framework of trust. Children walked to school alone. Teenagers explored independence cautiously but freely. Communities relied on familiarity and routine rather than suspicion. Danger was thought to come from the unknown, not from the familiar faces of everyday life. This sense of safety, deeply ingrained, shaped how people interacted with the world and how they assessed risk. The young lives touched by this story belonged to that world. They were ordinary in the most human sense. They had families, routines, personalities, and dreams that were still forming. Their lives were not defined by fear, but by possibility. They were part of a society that believed in forward motion, in growth, in the idea that tomorrow would resemble today, only better. What makes their stories especially haunting is not only what happened, but how little warning there was beforehand. There were no dramatic signals, no visible threats. The world around them appeared stable. The adults they encountered were expected to be safe, responsible, and protective. Trust was not questioned, it was assumed. This trust extended beyond family into the wider social fabric. Neighbors looked out for one another. Adults were granted authority simply by virtue of age and demeanor. The idea that danger could exist behind a calm expression or a polite conversation was not part of everyday thinking. This collective assumption created an environment where vulnerability could go unnoticed. The voices that went unheard were not silenced by neglect or indifference, but by circumstance. They belonged to individuals who lived ordinary lives, whose routines were familiar and whose presence blended into the rhythm of daily life. Their disappearance did not immediately signal danger because society had not yet learned to look for it in the places it existed. Families searched, worried, hoped. Communities responded with concern, but often lacked the information or framework to comprehend what was happening. In a time before instant communication and widespread media coverage, information traveled slowly. Patterns were harder to detect. Connections were easier to miss. What is often overlooked in discussions of such tragedies is the emotional environment in which they unfolded. There was confusion, disbelief, and a deep sense of helplessness. People wanted answers, but struggled to imagine the reality behind the unanswered questions. The absence of clear explanations created a space filled with uncertainty and quiet fear. For those directly affected, life became suspended between hope and dread. Days passed without clarity. Each moment carried the possibility of resolution or loss. This emotional limbo was its own form of suffering. one that lingered long after events themselves faded from public attention. The tragedy of unheard voices is not only that they were silenced, but that their stories were incomplete. They were not defined by what happened to them, yet history often reduces them to that moment alone. In truth, they were children, siblings, friends, individuals with inner worlds as rich and complex as anyone else's. It is essential to remember that their lives were meaningful long before they intersected with tragedy. They laughed, argued, dreamed, and imagined futures that were never realized. Their absence left quiet gaps in families, schools, and neighborhoods, absences that never fully healed. The world around them continued to move forward, but something fundamental had changed. Trust was no longer unconditional. Safety no longer assumed. A sense of vulnerability entered public consciousness, altering how people viewed their surroundings and one another. This chapter of the story is not about sensationalism or spectacle. It is about remembrance, about acknowledging the humanity that existed before headlines, before fear, before loss. It is about recognizing that every historical tragedy begins with individuals whose lives mattered deeply to those who knew them. As time passed, the weight of unanswered questions grew heavier. Families searched for closure, for understanding, for any fragment of truth that might ease the ache of uncertainty. The silence surrounding these voices became a presence of its own, heavy, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The world often moves on quickly, but for those left behind, time stretches differently. Memory becomes both comfort and burden. The absence becomes part of daily life, woven into moments both ordinary and profound. In remembering these voices, we do more than recount history. We restore humanity to those whose stories were interrupted. We acknowledge that behind every tragedy are lives filled with meaning, dignity, and hope. As this chapter closes, the weight of what was lost lingers. The silence left behind is not empty. It is filled with echoes of lives that deserve to continue, stories that deserve to unfold. And as the narrative moves forward, those voices remain at its heart, reminding us that understanding the past is not only about examining those who caused harm, but also about honoring those who were taken from the world far too soon. As the silence surrounding the missing deepened, it began to shape the emotional landscape of entire communities. What had once felt like isolated disappearances slowly formed a pattern that no one wanted to name. The uncertainty was unbearable not because of what was known, but because of what was not. Families lived suspended between hope and grief, between the possibility of reunion and the growing fear that answers might never come. In the absence of certainty, imagination filled the void. Parents replayed memories endlessly, searching for signs they might have missed. Friends retraced conversations, moments, gestures, anything that might offer clarity. Ordinary places took on new meaning. A street corner, a bus stop, a familiar path. Each became charged with emotion, holding echoes of voices now missing. This uncertainty created a quiet kind of suffering. It was not loud or dramatic, but persistent. It lived in unanswered questions, in sleepless nights, in the unbearable stillness of waiting. The absence of truth became its own form of presence, shaping daily life in ways few could articulate. Communities responded in fragmented ways. Some clung to hope, organizing searches and sharing information. Others retreated inward, afraid of confronting what might be unfolding. The lack of clarity created a tension that lingered in conversations, in glances exchanged between neighbors, in the cautious way people began to look at one another. During this time, the idea of safety subtly shifted. What had once been assumed now required consideration. Parents became more watchful. Familiar routes were reconsidered. Trust, once freely given, began to feel fragile. This shift did not come from a single event, but from a growing awareness that something was wrong, even if no one yet understood what. The emotional toll of this uncertainty cannot be overstated. For families, the absence of answers became a daily burden. They existed in a space between hope and despair, where every moment carried the possibility of news. Time moved strangely in this space, sometimes unbearably slow, sometimes too fast to comprehend. The broader community, too, felt the weight of this ambiguity. Conversations softened. Laughter felt cautious. A subtle tension settled over ordinary interactions. People became more attentive, more guarded. The world felt slightly altered, as though an unseen presence hovered just beyond awareness. Yet even as fear grew, daily life continued. People went to work, children attended school, routines persisted. This coexistence of normalcy and dread created a surreal atmosphere. The human capacity to adapt allowed life to move forward, even as unease settled quietly beneath the surface. The voices that went unheard were not only those of the missing, but also those of the families who struggled to be understood. Their grief did not always fit into neat narratives. It lingered, unresolved, often misunderstood by a world eager for closure. Their pain did not fade with time. It evolved, becoming part of their identity. In moments of solitude, memories took on new significance. A laugh remembered, a gesture recalled. These fragments became anchors, reminders of lives that had once filled spaces now left empty. Memory became both comfort and burden, a way to keep loved ones present even as absence grew heavier. The passage of time did not bring clarity, only distance. As days turned into months, and months into years, the absence became normalized in public discourse. Yet for those directly affected, time did not heal so much as reshape grief into something quieter but no less powerful. What makes this period especially poignant is the contrast between what was known and what was not. The lack of information created a vacuum filled by imagination and fear. In that vacuum, questions echoed endlessly. What happened? Why? Could something have been done differently? These questions had no answers, only echoes. The silence surrounding these voices was not deliberate neglect. It was the result of a world unprepared to confront the reality unfolding within it. Society lacked the language, the awareness, and the frameworks needed to understand such loss. As a result, many suffered in quiet isolation. Over time, this collective silence became part of the story itself. It shaped how events were remembered and how lessons were learned. It revealed the cost of assuming safety and the danger of overlooking vulnerability. In remembering these unheard voices, it becomes clear that tragedy does not begin with violence. It begins with invisibility. When people are unseen, unheard, or dismissed, the conditions for harm take root quietly. Recognition, compassion, and vigilance are often the first lines of protection. As this chapter closes, the weight of absence remains. The stories left untold continue to echo, not as distant memories, but as reminders of the human cost of silence. These voices, though unheard in their time, still speak through the impact they left behind. Their presence endures not in headlines, but in the spaces they once occupied, in the hearts of those who remember, and in the quiet resolve to listen more closely, to care more deeply, and to never overlook the humanity that exists in every life. Chapter 10: Cracks in the Illusion. Every constructed world, no matter how carefully maintained, carries within it the seeds of its own unraveling. For Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, The private reality they had built together, sealed by silence, control, and shared belief, began to show subtle fractures. These cracks did not appear suddenly or dramatically. They emerged quietly, through moments of tension, inconsistency, and the slow pressure of living a divided life that up to this point, their sense of control had relied on distance. Emotional distance from others, moral distance from consequence, and psychological distance from responsibility. But maintaining such separation requires constant effort. Over time, even the most carefully maintained illusions begin to strain under the weight of reality. The first cracks appeared not as fear or panic, but as friction. Small disruptions in routine, moments of unease that were difficult to name. The balance they had maintained between public normalcy and private detachment began to feel fragile. The emotional energy required to sustain two realities grew heavier, and with that weight came strain. Externally, life continued to move forward. People interacted with them in familiar ways. Conversations remained polite. Daily obligations persisted. Yet beneath this surface, the pressure of concealment slowly intensified. What had once felt effortless now required attention. Silence, once comforting, became tense. Control, once assumed, required maintenance. This stage marked a shift in their internal dynamic. The sense of invulnerability that had once defined their bond began to waver, not because of remorse or doubt, but because maintaining the illusion demanded constant vigilance. The slightest disruption, a question asked too directly, an unexpected interaction, felt threatening. For Myra, this period brought subtle emotional strain. Her role as mediator between worlds became increasingly demanding. She navigated expectations, conversations, and appearances with care, conscious that even small inconsistencies could expose what lay beneath. The emotional labor of concealment took its toll, though she rarely acknowledged it even to herself. Ian, too, felt the pressure, though he expressed it differently. His sense of control depended on predictability, and unpredictability unsettled him. The idea that external forces might intrude upon their carefully managed world challenged his belief in his own mastery. While he remained outwardly composed, moments of tension surfaced beneath the surface. These tensions did not erupt into conflict. Instead, they deepened their reliance on one another. Each became the other's anchor, reinforcing the belief that only together could they maintain stability. This mutual dependence further isolated them from the world beyond their shared identity. At the same time, subtle signs began to emerge that their private world was not as impermeable as they believed. Small disruptions, questions from others, changes in routine, moments of uncertainty, hinted that the boundary between secrecy and exposure was thinning. These were not overt threats, but quiet reminders that isolation has limits. As pressure mounted, their internal narrative adapted. Instead of reconsidering their path, they reframed challenges as external interference. This reinforced an us versus them mentality, deepening their emotional separation from society. The more threatened they felt, the more tightly they clung to each other and to the beliefs that bound them. This shift marked a turning point. The sense of invincibility that once surrounded them began to crack. Not dramatically, but persistently. The effort required to maintain control grew heavier, and the emotional cost of sustaining their dual lives increased. Importantly, this phase did not involve confession or remorse. It involved reinforcement. Faced with pressure, they doubled down on the internal logic that had guided them thus far. Doubt was reframed as danger. Vulnerability became something to suppress. The illusion had to be protected at all costs. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance began to show in subtle ways. Moments of irritation, impatience, or unease surfaced. These were not dramatic breakdowns, but quiet indicators of strain. The emotional equilibrium they had once maintained so carefully was beginning to destabilize. Yet, even as cracks formed, the world around them remained largely unaware. Daily life continued. People passed them in the street without suspicion. The contrast between inner tension and outer normalcy grew sharper, intensifying the sense of isolation. This stage of their story is defined by that contrast, the widening gap between appearance and reality. It is the moment when the structure they built begins to creak under its own weight, not from external force, but from internal pressure. Cracks do not always signal collapse. Sometimes, they simply reveal that something is under strain. For Brady and Hindley, these early fractures marked the beginning of an unraveling that could no longer be fully controlled. As their world grew more fragile, the consequences of their choices edged closer to the surface. The illusion of safety, once so convincing, now required constant reinforcement. And with each effort to preserve it, the risk of exposure grew. This was the beginning of the end of their private certainty, the moment when the illusion of control first began to falter. As the tension beneath their carefully constructed world continued to build, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. What had once felt controlled and deliberate now required constant attention. Every interaction, every choice carried weight. The illusion of stability could still be maintained, but only through effort that grew more exhausting with time. This stage of their journey was marked not by dramatic events, but by emotional compression. The space in which they operated felt smaller, tighter, more constrained. Their private world, once expansive and self-sustaining, began to feel crowded by its own contradictions. The beliefs that had once unified them now demanded maintenance, justification, and reinforcement. For Myra, the strain manifested as emotional fatigue. The effort required to maintain composure in public while sustaining loyalty in private became increasingly difficult. She found herself constantly adjusting, anticipating, and managing perceptions. The role she had assumed required vigilance, an unspoken awareness that any misstep could fracture the fragile balance she worked so hard to preserve. Ian, too, felt the pressure, though he expressed it differently. His need for control intensified as uncertainty crept in. Control had always been his anchor, but now it felt threatened by forces beyond his influence. The idea that their carefully constructed world might not hold began to disturb the sense of superiority he had long cultivated. This internal tension created subtle changes in their dynamic. Conversations became more guarded. Silences carried weight. The ease that once defined their connection began to give way to a quiet urgency. They were still united, but that unity was increasingly forged through shared anxiety rather than shared belief. What is striking about this phase is how little of it was visible to the outside world. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public breakdowns. Instead, the strain manifested internally, in thoughts left unspoken and emotions carefully concealed. The world saw nothing unusual, just two individuals moving through daily life. Yet internally, the pressure was building. The emotional cost of sustaining their dual existence was becoming unsustainable. The mental energy required to maintain separation between their inner world and outer reality was immense. This strain did not prompt reflection or retreat. Instead, it pushed them further inward. As the illusion weakened, so too did their ability to adapt. The strategies that once worked began to feel insufficient. The sense of control that had anchored them started to feel fragile. This created a paradox. The more threatened they felt, the more tightly they clung to the very beliefs that were destabilizing them. This period also marked a shift in how they perceived the outside world. What had once felt distant now felt intrusive. Everyday interactions became potential threats, not because of any direct danger, but because they represented unpredictability. The world beyond their control felt increasingly hostile simply by existing outside their narrative. In response, they withdrew further. Emotional walls grew higher. The boundary between us and them hardened. This polarization deepened their isolation and reinforced their reliance on one another. Their shared identity became not just a bond, but a refuge. The danger of this dynamic lies in its self-perpetuating nature. Isolation breeds dependence. Dependence reinforces belief, and belief justifies isolation. Each step strengthens the next, creating a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to break. As their world narrowed, the consequences of their internal choices grew heavier. The weight of what had been set in motion began to press in on them, though not yet in ways they could fully articulate. There was a sense of approaching inevitability, not fear, but recognition that something irreversible was forming. This stage was defined by anticipation rather than action, a sense that events were moving forward, even if slowly. The calm that surrounded them was no longer peaceful. It was charged with unspoken tension. Every quiet moment carried an undercurrent of expectation. The emotional strain also affected how they perceived time. Moments seemed elongated, filled with anticipation. The future felt close, almost pressing against the present. Yet clarity remained elusive. They were moving forward without fully understanding where the path would lead. Despite this internal turbulence, the external world remained unaware. Life continued with its usual rhythms. People went about their routines, unaware that beneath the surface of ordinary interactions, something fragile was beginning to fracture. This dissonance between inner tension and outer calm defined this phase of their story. It was the calm before a deeper unraveling, a period where the foundations began to shift but had not yet collapsed. As the cracks widened, the illusion of control weakened further. What had once felt stable now required constant reinforcement. And with each effort to maintain that stability, the pressure increased. This was the moment when the trajectory of their lives became impossible to redirect. The path ahead, though still obscured, was narrowing. The choices they had made had set forces in motion that could no longer be undone. And as the illusion continued to fracture, the world moved one step closer to witnessing the consequences of what had long been hidden beneath the surface. Chapter 11. Arrest, Interrogation, and Truths Revealed. The unraveling did not arrive with drama or spectacle. It arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the truth itself hesitated before stepping into the light. For a long time, the world around Brady and Myra Hindley had remained unaware of the full reality behind their carefully maintained facade. But once the first thread was pulled, the fabric of secrecy began to loosen, revealing a truth far heavier than anyone had imagined. The moment of exposure did not feel cinematic. It felt procedural, restrained, almost ordinary. That ordinariness made it all the more unsettling. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic outbursts. Instead, there was a slow shift, a change in atmosphere, a subtle tightening of consequence. What had once existed in isolation now entered the realm of scrutiny. When authorities began to piece together fragments of information, it became clear that something was deeply wrong. The process was gradual, marked by questions, inconsistencies, and the quiet realization that events long thought unrelated were connected by unseen threads. This realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, as patterns began to emerge from fragments that previously seemed meaningless. For those tasked with uncovering the truth, the experience was deeply unsettling. What they encountered defied expectation. The individuals involved did not fit any conventional image of danger. They appeared composed, articulate, and unremarkable. This contrast made the emerging reality even more difficult to process. The idea that such darkness could exist beneath such calm challenged deeply held assumptions about human behavior. Interrogations began with restraint. Questions were measured, careful, designed to uncover facts rather than provoke reactions. In these early moments, silence often spoke louder than words. Responses were controlled, deliberate, and emotionally restrained. There were no dramatic displays of guilt or panic. Instead, there was a quiet calculation, a weighing of words and consequences. For investigators, this composure was deeply unsettling. It contradicted expectations and made the truth harder to grasp. The absence of visible emotion created a dissonance that lingered long after conversations ended. It was as though the emotional reality of what had occurred existed on a different plane altogether. As questioning continued, fragments of truth began to surface, not all at once, but in pieces. Each piece carried weight, revealing glimpses of a reality far darker than anticipated. These revelations did not arrive with clarity or closure. They emerged slowly, forcing those involved to confront the scale of what had been hidden. For the public, news of the arrests spread gradually. At first, there was confusion, then disbelief. The idea that such acts could originate from such ordinary individuals was deeply unsettling. Communities struggled to reconcile the image they knew with the truth emerging before them. Trust fractured, not just in individuals, but in assumptions about safety and familiarity. Families and loved ones were thrust into a painful limbo. Questions multiplied faster than answers. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily, compounded by the emotional toll of waiting. Every new detail carried both hope and dread. The truth, when it emerged, did not offer relief, only deeper sorrow. The interrogation process revealed more than facts. It exposed the psychological distance that had defined the perpetrators' inner worlds. Their responses were often measured, detached, and unsettlingly calm. This composure did not stem from ignorance, but from emotional separation, a detachment that had been cultivated over time. For those listening, this detachment was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. It suggested a disconnect not only from the consequences of actions, but from the emotional reality of others. It challenged assumptions about remorse, empathy, and accountability. As the investigation unfolded, the magnitude of what had occurred became impossible to ignore. Each revelation deepened the collective shock. The narrative that emerged was not one of chaos, but of chilling deliberation. This realization forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the fragility of moral boundaries. The process of uncovering the truth was slow and emotionally taxing. It required patience, persistence, and resilience from all involved. For investigators, the task was not only to document facts, but to confront the human cost embedded within them. For the public, the revelations altered perceptions of safety and trust. The idea that such acts could exist within familiar settings reshaped the collective psyche. Communities were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil does not always announce itself. It can exist quietly, behind ordinary faces. This phase of the story marked a turning point. The hidden world that had existed in isolation was now exposed to scrutiny. The silence that had protected it was broken, replaced by questions that demanded answers. Yet even as truths emerged, they did not bring closure. Instead, they opened deeper wounds. raising new questions about responsibility, awareness, and the limits of understanding. The process of reckoning had begun, but its full weight had yet to be felt. The revelations were only the beginning of a long and painful confrontation with reality, one that would reshape lives, communities, and collective memory. As the investigation deepened, the weight of what had been uncovered began to settle heavily on everyone involved. What initially appeared as a series of troubling inconsistencies slowly transformed into a fuller, more devastating understanding. Each new detail added gravity, not through shock, but through clarity. The truth did not explode into view. It unfolded methodically, demanding patience, resilience, and emotional endurance from those tasked with confronting it. The process of interrogation revealed more than facts. It revealed a psychological landscape shaped by detachment and control. The individuals at the center of the investigation spoke in measured tones, choosing words carefully, often withholding more than they revealed. Their composure stood in stark contrast to the emotional devastation experienced by those learning the truth from the outside. This emotional divide created an unsettling atmosphere, one in which understanding felt perpetually just out of reach. Investigators were struck by the absence of visible remorse. This absence was not loud or defiant. It was quiet, contained, and unsettling. Responses were often analytical rather than emotional, as though events were being discussed at a distance. This emotional remove made the process deeply challenging, as it contradicted expectations of how guilt or sorrow should appear as evidence accumulated. The scale of what had occurred became impossible to ignore. The investigation moved carefully, step by step, ensuring accuracy and accountability. Each confirmed detail carried emotional weight, not only for those directly involved, but for the broader public, who followed developments with a mixture of disbelief and grief. For families waiting for answers, this period was one of painful limbo. The slow unveiling of truth did not bring immediate closure. Instead, it often reopened wounds, forcing them to confront realities they had feared yet hoped never to face. Grief became layered: grief for loss, for uncertainty, and for the realization that the world they trusted had failed to protect them. Communities responded in complex ways. Some sought understanding, others struggled with anger or disbelief. The idea that such acts could occur within familiar surroundings shook collective assumptions about safety and trust. Conversations shifted. People questioned how well they truly knew those around them, and whether warning signs had been missed. The legal process, while necessary, unfolded slowly. Each step was deliberate, measured, and often emotionally taxing. The pursuit of truth required patience, precision, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. For those involved in the investigation, the work extended beyond professional duty. It became a moral burden carried long after the formal process ended. As more information surfaced, the narrative surrounding the case evolved. It was no longer just about individuals, but about the systems, assumptions, and blind spots that had allowed such harm to occur. The focus widened from individual actions to collective responsibility: how society understands vulnerability, recognizes warning signs, and responds to the unseen. Throughout this period, the emotional toll was profound. Investigators, families, and community members alike grappled with feelings of helplessness and grief. The weight of unanswered questions lingered, even as some answers finally emerged. Closure, when it came, was partial at best. What made this phase especially difficult was the realization that understanding did not bring comfort. Knowing what happened did not ease the pain. In many ways, it intensified it. The truth forced a reckoning not only with events, But with the fragility of safety and the complexity of human behavior, as the legal proceedings continued, the broader implications of the case became clear. It challenged assumptions about trust, authority, and the nature of evil. It exposed how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary harm, and how easily warning signs can be overlooked when they do not fit expected patterns. The revelations also prompted reflection on prevention and awareness. Questions arose about how such tragedies might be recognized earlier, how communities might better protect the vulnerable, and how silence can sometimes be as damaging as action. These reflections did not provide easy answers, but they shaped future conversations and policies. Throughout it all, the human cost remained central. Behind every detail were lives irrevocably changed, families grieving, communities mourning, and individuals forever marked by loss. The impact extended far beyond the courtroom, reaching into the collective consciousness of a nation. As this chapter drew to a close, one truth became clear: the unveiling of facts, while necessary, could never fully heal the wounds left behind. Justice, in its formal sense, could address actions, but it could not restore what was lost. The story now stood at a crossroads, between revelation and reflection, between accountability and remembrance. The next phase would not focus solely on events, but on the enduring legacy left in their wake. The truth had emerged, but its echoes would continue to shape lives for years to come. Chapter 12: Trial, Media, and Public Horror. When the case finally entered the public arena, it did so with a weight that few events in modern Britain had ever carried. What had once been whispers, uncertainties, and fragments of truth now became the focus of national attention. Courtrooms, newspapers, and living rooms across the country became spaces of collective reckoning. The story was no longer confined to investigators and families. It belonged to the public consciousness. The trial did not begin with spectacle, but with a heavy sense of gravity. From the outset, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary legal proceeding. The courtroom itself became a place where silence carried meaning, where every word felt weighted with consequence. People arrived not out of curiosity alone, but out of a need to understand how such darkness could exist so close to ordinary life. The presence of the accused created a profound emotional tension. They did not resemble the monstrous figures many expected. Instead, they appeared composed, controlled, and disturbingly ordinary. This contrast unsettled observers deeply. It challenged assumptions about what evil looks like and forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most disturbing acts do not always come from those who appear visibly disturbed. As evidence was presented, the atmosphere grew heavier. Each detail added another layer to the collective shock. The courtroom became a space of emotional confrontation, where facts collided with grief and understanding clashed with disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the calm demeanor of the accused with the gravity of the crimes being described. The media played a powerful role during this time. Coverage was intense, widespread, and often relentless. Headlines filled newspapers. Radio broadcasts carried updates into homes across the country. The case became inescapable, entering daily conversation and shaping public discourse. With this exposure came both awareness and unease. For many, the most unsettling aspect was not the acts themselves, but the realization that such events could occur unnoticed within familiar environments. The sense of safety people had long relied upon felt shaken. Trust in neighbors, in routine, in the predictability of daily life was quietly eroded. The courtroom proceedings forced society to confront difficult questions about responsibility, awareness, and prevention. How could such harm go unnoticed? What signs had been missed? Could it have been prevented? These questions lingered, unresolved, echoing far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Throughout the trial, the emotional weight was immense. Family members of those lost carried grief that was both personal and public. Their presence served as a painful reminder that behind every legal argument were lives forever changed. The courtroom became a place of collective mourning as much as judgment. The media, while tasked with informing the public, also shaped perception. Sensationalism sometimes overshadowed sensitivity, and headlines often struggled to balance truth with restraint. This tension reflected a broader societal struggle: how to confront horrific realities without losing humanity in the process. Public reaction ranged from anger to disbelief, from sorrow to fear. Conversations in homes and workplaces turned toward questions of safety, trust, and moral responsibility. The case forced people to acknowledge vulnerabilities they had long ignored. It became clear that the idea of danger as something distant or obvious was no longer sustainable. At the same time, there was a growing awareness of the need for compassion, not for the actions themselves, but for those affected by them. The emotional toll extended far beyond the courtroom, touching families, communities, and even those tasked with reporting and documenting the events. The trial also marked a turning point in how society discussed crime and accountability. It challenged simplistic narratives and demanded a deeper examination of how harm develops over time. The focus shifted from isolated acts to broader patterns, from individual guilt to collective responsibility. Throughout the proceedings, a heavy stillness often filled the courtroom. Silence became a language of its own, conveying grief, disbelief, and the weight of irreversible loss. In those moments, words seemed insufficient to capture the depth of what had occurred. As testimony continued, it became increasingly clear that this was not a story with a clean resolution. The legal process could deliver verdicts, but it could not restore what had been lost. Justice, in its formal sense, could not fully address the emotional devastation left behind. The trial served as a mirror held up to society, reflecting uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, trust, and the human capacity for harm. It forced a collective reckoning, not only with the individuals involved, but with the systems and assumptions that had allowed such events to unfold. By the time this phase came to a close, the public had been irrevocably changed. The case had entered the cultural memory, reshaping conversations about safety, responsibility, and awareness. The illusion of distance between ordinary life and unimaginable harm had been shattered. What followed would not be an ending, but a long process of reflection, remembrance, and reckoning. The echoes of the trial would continue to influence thought, policy, and perception for years to come. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the atmosphere surrounding it began to shift. What had started as shock slowly transformed into something deeper and more complex, a collective reckoning. The courtroom was no longer just a place where facts were examined. It became a space where a nation confronted its own vulnerability. The questions being asked extended beyond guilt or innocence. They reached into the foundations of trust, safety, and moral responsibility. When judgments were delivered, they did not bring closure in the way many had hoped. Legal resolution, while necessary, felt incomplete. For families who had waited so long for answers, the finality of the courtroom did not quiet the pain. Instead, it often deepened it. The legal process could define accountability, but it could not restore what had been taken or answer every lingering question. Outside the courtroom, public reaction continued to evolve. Newspapers and broadcasts analyzed every detail, sometimes with care, sometimes with intensity that bordered on intrusion. The story dominated conversation, not because people were drawn to horror, but because it challenged deeply held beliefs about safety, trust, and the nature of evil. The realization that such acts could exist within ordinary settings unsettled the collective sense of security. As time passed, a quieter reflection began to take hold. The shock gave way to contemplation. People began to ask not only how such events occurred, but how society might learn from them. Discussions emerged around awareness, responsibility, and the importance of listening, especially to voices that are often overlooked. For families affected, the aftermath was a long and painful journey. Grief did not follow a linear path. It ebbed and flowed, sometimes softened by time, sometimes sharpened by memory. The public attention, while initially validating, eventually became another burden to carry. Healing, when it came at all, was private and deeply personal. Communities, too, were changed. Trust was no longer assumed. Parents became more cautious, conversations more guarded. Yet alongside this caution grew a quieter resilience, a determination to protect, to pay attention, and to care more deeply for one another. Out of tragedy, a fragile sense of collective responsibility began to form. The case also left a lasting mark on how society discussed crime and justice. It challenged simplistic narratives and highlighted the complexity of human behavior. The idea that evil could be easily recognized or neatly contained was dismantled. In its place emerged a more nuanced understanding of how harm can grow quietly, unnoticed, within familiar spaces. Media coverage, over time, became more reflective. Initial sensationalism gave way to deeper analysis, exploring the psychological, social, and cultural factors that allowed such events to unfold. This shift did not erase the pain, but it helped foster a more thoughtful conversation about prevention and awareness in academic and professional circles. The case influenced discussions around mental health, social isolation, and the importance of early intervention. It became a reference point for understanding how seemingly ordinary lives can conceal profound dysfunction. These discussions, while often uncomfortable, contributed to a broader effort to recognize warning signs before tragedy occurs. Yet, for all the analysis and reflection, there remained an undeniable truth. Some wounds do not heal completely. They become part of a collective memory, shaping how future generations understand vulnerability and responsibility. The names and stories involved became symbols, not of notoriety, but of caution and remembrance. The passage of time softened certain edges but did not erase the impact. Anniversaries came and went, often marked by quiet reflection rather than public spectacle. The story remained present, not as a constant reminder of horror, but as a solemn lesson woven into the fabric of social consciousness. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this chapter lies in its reminder of human complexity. It challenged simplistic divisions between good and evil, forcing a deeper examination of how harm can emerge from ordinary circumstances. It underscored the importance of empathy, vigilance, and connection, not as abstract ideals, but as essential safeguards that as the years passed, the focus gradually shifted from the perpetrators to the lives affected and the lessons learned. Memorials, conversations, and educational efforts sought to honor those lost by ensuring their stories were not reduced to headlines or forgotten statistics. In this way, the tragedy became part of a broader human narrative, one that speaks to the necessity of compassion, the dangers of silence, and the responsibility shared by communities to look after one another. The trial may have ended, but its echoes continued to shape understanding and awareness. The story remained not as a spectacle, but as a reminder that vigilance, empathy, and connection are essential in preventing darkness from taking root unseen. As this chapter closes, The focus turns toward what remains after the courtroom lights fade, the enduring impact on memory, meaning, and the collective responsibility to remember, reflect, and protect. Chapter 13: Prison Years and Psychological Descent. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the echoes of judgment faded, a different chapter began, one defined not by public spectacle, but by isolation, routine, and the slow unraveling of inner worlds. Prison is often imagined as a place of immediate reckoning, where consequences are felt instantly and clearly. In reality, it is a place of long silences, repetition, and reflection. For Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, incarceration did not bring resolution. It marked the beginning of a prolonged psychological descent that unfolded over years rather than moments. The transition from public scrutiny to institutional confinement was abrupt. The intensity of attention that had once surrounded them disappeared almost overnight, replaced by rigid schedules, controlled environments, and enforced solitude. This shift altered the emotional landscape entirely. Without the constant presence of observers, the external pressures that had once defined their experience gave way to a quieter, more internal struggle. Prison life imposed structure, but not clarity. Days were measured in routines rather than meaning. Time slowed, stretching into long, indistinguishable stretches. For some, this environment fosters reflection or remorse. For others, it deepens detachment. In this case, the psychological trajectories of both individuals began to diverge in subtle but significant ways. For Myra, the early years of imprisonment were marked by confusion and emotional turbulence. The separation from the identity she had built around her relationship was profound. Much of her sense of self had been intertwined with another person, and without that connection, she was forced to confront an unfamiliar solitude. This separation created an emotional void, one filled with conflicting feelings, regret, denial, longing, and self-preservation. Isolation had a destabilizing effect. Without the reinforcing presence that had once defined her world, she struggled to reconcile her past actions with her present reality. There were moments of apparent reflection, but also moments of emotional withdrawal. The prison environment did not encourage vulnerability. Survival often depended on emotional restraint. In this context, introspection became fragmented, interrupted by the need to adapt. Ian, by contrast, appeared to retreat further into himself. The structured environment of prison, with its clear hierarchies and predictable routines, aligned with his preference for order and control. He adapted quickly, maintaining a composed exterior that masked deeper psychological rigidity. Where others might have been shaken by confinement, he appeared to find a strange sense of equilibrium within it. This contrast between them became more pronounced over time. While both were confined physically, their internal experiences diverged. Myra grappled with identity and loss. Ian withdrew into intellectual isolation. Their psychological connection, once so central, weakened as physical separation and institutional boundaries took hold. The prison environment also altered how they were perceived by others. Guards, staff, and fellow inmates formed impressions shaped by behavior rather than history. This dynamic created a new social reality, one where reputation had to be renegotiated. In this setting, emotional restraint often functioned as a form of self-protection. Over time, the monotony of incarceration began to erode emotional resilience. Days blurred together. The absence of meaningful stimuli intensified introspection, sometimes to a destabilizing degree. For some, this led to reflection and remorse. For others, it reinforced existing patterns of detachment and control, The psychological effects of long-term confinement are complex. Isolation can distort perception, heighten internal narratives, and deepen existing traits. In this environment, unresolved emotions often resurface with greater intensity. Without external distractions, the mind turns inward, sometimes in ways that are difficult to contain. For Myra, this inward turn was complicated by guilt and public condemnation. The awareness of how she was perceived by society, by families, by history weighed heavily. Yet expressing vulnerability in such an environment was fraught with risk. Emotional openness could be misinterpreted or exploited. As a result, self-reflection often remained internal, unexpressed. Ian, on the other hand, appeared to maintain emotional distance. His interactions were controlled, measured, and reserved. He continued to project an image of composure, even as years passed. This emotional detachment, once a tool of control, became a form of insulation against the reality of his circumstances. The prison system itself, while designed to enforce accountability, often amplifies psychological extremes. Isolation, repetition, and lack of autonomy can intensify existing traits rather than transform them. In this environment, growth is neither guaranteed nor straightforward. As years passed, the contrast between public memory and personal experience became more pronounced. Outside, their names remained symbols of horror. Inside, they became individuals navigating a confined existence shaped by routine and reflection. The dissonance between these realities created a psychological tension that never fully resolved. This phase of their lives was defined less by action and more by endurance. The drama of the past gave way to the slow erosion of time. Days blended into one another, marked by institutional rhythms rather than personal milestones. Yet even in this stillness, the weight of what had occurred remained present. Memory does not fade easily, especially when there is no escape from it. For both, the prison years became a prolonged confrontation with self, one shaped by silence, isolation, and the inescapable awareness of what had been done. This chapter of their story is not about redemption or absolution. It is about the long aftermath of choices made and the enduring consequences that follow. It is a reminder that accountability extends beyond courtrooms and sentences, unfolding slowly in the quiet spaces of time. As this phase continued, the psychological journey grew more complex, marked by internal struggle rather than external drama. The world outside moved on, but within the prison walls, the echoes of past actions lingered. And as the years passed, those echoes began to shape not only memory, but identity itself. As the years passed, time inside prison took on a different quality, no longer measured by events, but by endurance. Days blurred into months, and months into years, creating a slow, unbroken rhythm that reshaped perception itself. In such an environment, identity does not remain static. It either fractures under pressure or hardens into something unyielding. For Ian Brady and Myra Hinley, time became both a mirror and a cage. For Myra, the prolonged isolation gradually intensified her internal conflict. The separation from the identity she once clung to left a void that could not be easily filled. Without the emotional structure that had once defined her, she was forced to confront herself in ways she had never done before. This process was neither linear nor complete. There were moments of introspection followed by periods of emotional retreat. Guilt, denial, longing, and confusion coexisted, often without resolution. In the controlled environment of prison, emotional expression carried risks. Vulnerability could be misinterpreted or exploited, so restraint became a survival mechanism. This suppression, however, came at a cost. Feelings that could not be expressed outwardly turned inward, creating cycles of rumination and self-examination. Over time, this internalization deepened the psychological strain. Her sense of identity continued to shift. Stripped of external roles and relationships, she was forced to confront the parts of herself that had been defined through others. This confrontation was painful and disorienting. Without the emotional scaffolding she had relied upon, she faced the challenge of understanding who she was in isolation, a task complicated by regret, memory, and public condemnation. For Ian, the prison environment reinforced patterns that had long existed. Structure, predictability, and solitude suited his temperament. The routines of incarceration provided a sense of order that mirrored his internal preferences. He remained emotionally reserved, maintaining distance from others and rarely engaging in self-examination that might threaten his sense of control. Yet even within this apparent stability, time exerted its pressure. Long periods of isolation can amplify inner narratives, making them more rigid and self-reinforcing. Without meaningful interaction to challenge perspective, beliefs can become entrenched. For him, this often meant a continued retreat into intellectualization, where emotion was analyzed rather than felt. The contrast between their experiences highlights how confinement affects individuals differently. Where one grappled with emotional fragmentation, the other retreated further into psychological detachment. Neither path led to resolution. Instead, both reflected the long-term impact of isolation on the human mind. Over time, the outside world changed in ways that were only partially visible from within prison walls. Cultural attitudes shifted, conversations evolved, and new generations grew up with different perspectives. Yet inside, time moved slowly, marked by routine rather than transformation. This disconnect deepened the sense of separation from society. The psychological weight of public memory also lingered. Even in isolation, awareness of how one is perceived can shape identity. For both individuals, their names had become symbols rather than personal identifiers. This reduction of identity to public narrative further complicated any attempt at self-understanding or growth that in some moments, reflection may have emerged, fleeting and fragile. In others, denial or emotional distance offered a sense of protection. The human mind often seeks equilibrium, even in confinement, finding ways to adapt to prolonged stress. These adaptations, however, are not always healthy or healing. The prison environment, by its nature, limits opportunities for genuine rehabilitation unless accompanied by meaningful psychological support. Without such support, introspection can become circular, reinforcing existing patterns rather than transforming them. In this way, time becomes both a container and a constraint. For those observing from the outside, the question often arises, can people truly change under such conditions? The answer is complex. Change requires not only time, but willingness, support, and the capacity to confront painful truths. In the absence of these elements, growth remains uncertain. As the years passed, public interest fluctuated. Periods of renewed attention alternated with stretches of quiet. Yet for those directly affected, the story never truly faded. The passage of time did not erase memory. It only altered how it was carried. The prison years, then, were not a period of closure, but of continuation, a prolonged aftermath in which the consequences of past actions continued to unfold. The silence of confinement did not erase the past. It amplified its presence. This chapter of their lives stands as a reminder that accountability does not end with sentencing. The psychological impact of actions reverberates long after legal processes conclude. Time alone does not heal. It merely provides space in which unresolved truths linger. As this phase drew on, the question was no longer about what had happened, but about what remained: memory, consequence, and the enduring complexity of the human psyche. The world beyond the prison walls continued to evolve, while inside, the weight of the past remained constant. This prolonged stillness marked another turning point. The story was no longer about action or revelation, but about endurance and the long shadow cast by choices made long ago. And as time moved forward, the final chapters of this story would shift away from individuals and toward the broader legacy left behind. A legacy shaped not only by actions, but by the enduring impact those actions had on collective memory. Chapter 14. The Search That Never Truly Ended. Long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, the search continued, not always in fields or files, but in memory, in silence, and in the enduring ache of unanswered questions. Some searches do not conclude with discovery. They persist quietly, shaped by hope, grief, and the human need for understanding. This was one such search, for families affected by loss. The end of legal proceedings did not bring closure. Verdicts, sentences, and public acknowledgments could not restore what had been taken. Instead, they marked the beginning of a different journey, one defined by endurance rather than resolution. The absence left behind was not a void that time could simply fill. It was a presence that lingered in daily life, shaping moments both small and profound. In the years that followed, efforts to uncover remaining truths continued in various forms. Some searches were literal, grounded in the hope that answers still lay hidden. Others were emotional or psychological, shaped by a need to understand the incomprehensible. Each carried its own weight, driven not by spectacle, but by love, memory, and the refusal to forget. For many, the act of searching became a way of honoring those who had been lost. It was not about reopening wounds, but about acknowledging that certain questions mattered too deeply to be abandoned. In this sense, the search was not an expression of despair, but of devotion, a commitment to remembrance that transcended time. The landscape itself held a complicated role in this process. Places once associated with silence and uncertainty became sites of reflection. They carried layers of meaning shaped by memory, sorrow, and the passage of years. Nature, indifferent yet enduring, stood as both witness and reminder. The land did not provide answers, but it held space for those who sought them. Communities, too, were shaped by this ongoing search. Over time, collective memory evolved. The initial shocks softened into a quieter awareness, one that acknowledged pain without allowing it to define the future. Memorials, commemorations, and shared acts of remembrance emerged not as spectacles, but as gestures of respect and solidarity. The search also extended inward. For many, understanding required grappling with difficult questions about trust, vulnerability, and the human capacity for harm. It prompted reflection on how communities protect their most vulnerable, and how easily warning signs can be overlooked when familiarity breeds comfort. Importantly, this phase of the story is not driven by obsession, but by care. It is about the enduring human impulse to seek meaning in loss, to ensure that lives are not reduced to footnotes or forgotten narratives. In remembering, there is dignity. In remembering, there is resistance against erasure. Over time, the search evolved from a quest for answers into a commitment to awareness. Educational efforts, discussions, and reflections emerged, shaped by the desire to prevent future harm. While the past could not be changed, its lessons could inform the present. For those directly affected, the journey was deeply personal. Grief does not move in straight lines. It ebbs and flows, often resurfacing in unexpected moments. Yet within that grief, many found strength, not because the pain disappeared, but because it was carried with purpose. The broader society, too, learned to sit with discomfort. The story challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity, urging a more attentive, compassionate awareness of those around us. It reminded people that vigilance and care are not expressions of fear, but of responsibility. As years passed, the urgency of the search transformed into something quieter but no less powerful. It became a steady presence, a reminder that some stories do not conclude neatly, and that honoring the past requires ongoing attention. This phase of the narrative is defined not by resolution, but by remembrance. It is about the human need to bear witness, to acknowledge loss, and to hold space for those whose voices were silenced too soon. In doing so, the search continues, not for answers alone, but for understanding, compassion, and connection. The echoes of what was lost continue to shape the present, urging reflection rather than forgetting. They remind us that history lives not only in records and recollections, but in the choices we make moving forward. As this chapter draws to a close, the search remains unfinished, not because it failed, but because remembrance is ongoing. It lives in the quiet moments, in the commitment to awareness, and in the determination to ensure that no life is ever reduced to silence again. As time moved forward, the search transformed again, not as a physical pursuit, but as an act of remembrance woven into the fabric of public consciousness. What remained after the headlines faded was not silence, but a quiet responsibility carried by individuals, families, and communities. The search no longer sought answers alone. It sought meaning, dignity, and a way to carry memory without being consumed by it. Public remembrance took many forms. Some chose formal memorials, others quiet rituals known only to family and close friends. These acts were not meant to reopen wounds, but to affirm that lives once lived still mattered. In remembering, people reclaimed a sense of agency over grief. They chose to honor rather than forget, to speak names rather than allow them to fade into abstraction. Memory, however, is not static. It changes with time, shaped by perspective and understanding. As years passed, conversations matured. Where once there had been shock and disbelief, there grew a deeper reflection on how societies understand vulnerability, trust, and responsibility. The focus shifted from the events themselves to the broader lessons they carried. Education became one of the most meaningful legacies. Discussions about awareness, safeguarding, and emotional literacy found their way into schools, community spaces, and professional training. These efforts were not about instilling fear, but about fostering attentiveness and care. The aim was not to sensationalize the past, but to learn from it in a way that honored those affected. The act of remembering also became an act of resistance. Resistance against forgetting, against simplification, against reducing human lives to headlines. It was a way of saying that each life had depth, relationships, dreams, and meaning beyond the circumstances of loss. This form of remembrance refused to let tragedy define identity. For families, memory remained deeply personal. Grief did not vanish, it evolved. Over time, many learned to carry it alongside moments of joy, allowing space for both sorrow and love. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant finding a way to live fully while honoring what was lost. Communities, too, learned to carry shared memory with care. Through conversations, commemorations, and quiet acknowledgement, they kept awareness alive without allowing it to overshadow life itself. This balance was delicate but essential. It allowed communities to move forward without erasing the past. One of the most profound outcomes of this long journey was a shift in how people understood vulnerability. There emerged a greater recognition that harm often hides in plain sight, and that protection begins with attention, empathy, and willingness to act. This awareness became part of a broader cultural dialogue about responsibility and care. The legacy of such events is not confined to history books. It lives on in the way people look out for one another, in the questions they ask, and in the courage to speak when something feels wrong. These quiet acts of vigilance are among the most meaningful forms of remembrance. Over time, the narrative surrounding these events matured. Sensationalism gave way to reflection. Fear gave way to understanding. The focus shifted from the perpetrators to the lives affected and the lessons learned. This shift marked an important evolution in collective memory. There is a profound difference between remembering with fear and remembering with purpose. The former immobilizes, the latter empowers. By choosing the latter, communities transform loss into a commitment to care, awareness, and protection. In this way, the search that never truly ended became something larger than itself. It became a testament to resilience, to the human capacity to confront pain, learn from it, and move forward with compassion. It reminded us that remembrance is not about dwelling in the past, but about shaping a more mindful future. As years continue to pass, the echoes of these events remain, not as wounds that define, but as lessons that guide. They remind us that every life matters, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that the responsibility to care for one another is ongoing. This chapter, like the search it describes, does not end with certainty or closure. It ends with reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of loss, learning, and the enduring human need to remember with dignity. And in that remembrance, there is hope. Hope that awareness can prevent harm, that compassion can grow from tragedy, and that even the darkest chapters of history can illuminate a path toward understanding. Chapter 15. Echoes across generations. Long after events fade from headlines and courtrooms fall silent, their echoes continue to travel through time. Some stories refuse to settle into the past, not because they demand attention, but because they carry lessons that remain unfinished. The story of the Moors murders belongs to this category, not as a tale of notoriety, but as a reminder of how deeply human actions can ripple across generations. As years turned into decades, the world around the tragedy changed. New technologies emerged, social attitudes evolved, and conversations about mental health, safeguarding, and responsibility became more open. Yet the emotional weight of what had occurred did not disappear. It transformed, taking on new meaning as each generation encountered the story through its own lens. For those who lived through the original events, memory remained vivid. The sounds, the silence, the uncertainty all lingered. But for younger generations, the story arrived differently. It came through education, media, and conversation, shaped by distance and reflection rather than immediacy. This shift changed how the events were understood, allowing space for deeper examination rather than raw reaction. What endured most powerfully was not fear, but awareness. The story became a reference point in discussions about trust, vulnerability, and the importance of safeguarding. It reminded society that harm does not always arrive loudly, and that awareness often begins with noticing small changes, subtle signals, and quiet discomforts. The legacy of these events also reshaped how communities thought about responsibility. It encouraged people to ask difficult questions, not only about perpetrators, but about systems, environments, and the collective duty to protect the vulnerable. These conversations were not about blame, but about learning. Education played a crucial role in this evolution. Over time, schools, institutions, and families began to speak more openly about emotional well-being, boundaries, and communication. The aim was not to instill fear, but to empower individuals with understanding and awareness. Knowledge became a form of protection. Media, too, evolved in its approach. Where early coverage often leaned toward shock, later discussions sought nuance and sensitivity. There was a growing recognition that how stories are told matters deeply, that responsible storytelling can inform without sensationalizing and honor without exploiting. In this way, the story's impact expanded beyond its origins. It became part of a broader conversation about how societies process trauma and how they remember those affected. The focus gradually shifted away from notoriety and toward empathy, accountability, and prevention. Families touched by the events continued their own journeys of remembrance. For some, this meant private reflection. For others, it involved advocacy or quiet acts of remembrance. Each path was deeply personal, shaped by individual needs and resilience. What united them was the determination that the lives lost would not be reduced to footnotes. The idea of legacy, in this context, took on new meaning. It was no longer about the actions that caused harm, but about the values that emerged in response: compassion, vigilance, and a commitment to care for one another. These values became the true echoes passed from one generation to the next. As time moved forward, the story found its place within a broader cultural understanding of harm and healing. It served as a reminder that while darkness can leave lasting marks, it does not define the entirety of human experience. Growth, reflection, and change remain possible. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that remembrance is not passive. It requires intention. It asks us to listen, to reflect, and to act with empathy. It invites us to recognize vulnerability not as weakness, but as a shared human condition deserving of care. In remembering, we also reaffirm connection. We acknowledge that even in the face of profound loss, communities can choose compassion over fear, understanding over silence. This choice does not erase pain, but it transforms how pain is carried. The echoes of this story continue, not as a call to dwell on darkness, but as a reminder of responsibility to one another, to the present, and to the future. Through awareness and empathy, the past becomes a guide rather than a shadowed. As this chapter draws toward its close, the story turns from what happened to what remains. What remains is memory, shaped by reflection. What remains is the quiet strength found in remembrance. And what remains is the enduring hope that understanding can lead to protection, and that compassion can emerge even from the most difficult histories. As the final echoes of this story settle into collective memory, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a quiet understanding shaped by reflection, empathy, and responsibility. History does not end when events fade from the news. It continues in the ways people remember, learn, and choose to respond to what has come before. In this sense, the story does not close, it transforms. With time, societies often seek meaning in tragedy, not to justify it, but to ensure it does not vanish into abstraction. The events examined throughout this narrative became part of a larger moral landscape, influencing how communities understand vulnerability, trust, and the importance of vigilance. These lessons did not arrive fully formed. They emerged slowly through dialogue, education, and a growing willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of the most enduring outcomes has been a shift in how people think about responsibility. No longer viewed solely as individual burden, responsibility came to be understood as shared, woven through families, institutions, and communities. Awareness became a collective act, not an isolated one. This shift helped reshape conversations around care, safeguarding, and emotional literacy, particularly for the young and vulnerable. Generations who did not live through the events learned of them through stories told with greater care and sensitivity. Over time, the emphasis moved away from sensational detail and toward understanding context, impact, and prevention. This evolution in storytelling mattered. It allowed learning without exploitation, reflection without fear. The idea of remembrance also matured. Rather than focusing on the darkness itself, remembrance became about honoring life, acknowledging loss, and reinforcing the values that protect human dignity. Memory became an act of care rather than an anchor of sorrow. It offered space for grief while also nurturing hope. Communities found strength in this shared remembrance. Through quiet acts of acknowledgement, a moment of silence, a thoughtful conversation, a gesture of kindness, they affirmed that compassion endures. These acts may seem small, but collectively, they shape how societies heal and grow. Over time, awareness translated into action. Educational programs emphasized emotional intelligence, communication, and early intervention. Conversations around mental health became more open, less burdened by stigma. These changes did not erase the past, but they offered a way forward, one informed by understanding rather than fear. The power of remembrance lies not in dwelling on what cannot be changed, but in shaping what can. When stories are remembered with care, they become guides rather than wounds. They remind us of the importance of presence, of listening, and of responding with humanity. In this way, the legacy of this history extends beyond those directly involved. It becomes a quiet influence on how people look out for one another, how they respond to vulnerability, and how they choose empathy over indifference. It reminds us that even in the aftermath of profound loss, meaning can be found through connection and awareness. As years pass, the sharp edges of memory soften, but their lessons remain. New generations encounter these stories not as lived experience, but as echoes that encourage mindfulness, responsibility, and compassion. These echoes do not demand fear. They invite care. The story, at its core, is not about darkness alone. It is about the enduring capacity for reflection, learning, and growth. It is about how societies remember, how they honor those affected, and how they strive to ensure that compassion prevails over cruelty. In the quiet moments where reflection takes root, there is space for hope. Hope that awareness leads to protection. Hope that understanding leads to empathy. Hope that by remembering, we contribute to a world where harm is less likely to take hold. As this narrative draws to a close, it does so not with finality, but with continuity. The echoes remain, not as a burden, but as a reminder of shared responsibility. They ask us to listen more closely, care more deeply, and act with greater kindness. In remembering, we affirm life. In reflecting, we find purpose. And in choosing compassion, we honor those whose voices deserve to be heard, not through tragedy, but through the enduring commitment to humanity. This is where the story rests, not in silence, but in awareness, not in despair, but in understanding. And in that understanding, the final echo becomes not one of loss, but of hope.